Okay, May 40 here. So Israel pulled off a stunning rescue of 4 hostages on Saturday. And I'm checking out the New York Times. I want to know, how should I think about this? And the New York Times has an amazing revelation here on top of NewYorkTimes.com right now. Israel's euphoria over hostage rescue may be fleeting. Oh my God. Have you ever heard of a euphoria that is fleeting? All right. So this is the New York Times. All right. Israel's euphoria over hostage rescue may be fleeting. All forms of hysteria are fleeting. Right? There's no such thing. All forms of euphoria are fleeting. There's no such thing as permanent euphoria. Can you name me examples of euphoria that goes on for years and years and years? If so, it'd be wildly maladaptive. But for the New York Times, this is their top story right now. The idea that Israel's euphoria may be fleeting. Oh my God, next they're going to tell us that water flows downhill. Of course the euphoria is going to be fleeting. All euphorias are fleeting. Can you imagine going to a bride on her wedding day and say, hey, your euphoria is going to be fleeting? Or telling a happy newly married couple, hey, your euphoria is going to be fleeting? Or tell a friend who just had great news, you should know that your euphoria will be fleeting. It's such an absurd point. Of course, the euphoria will be fleeting. And what reason the New York Times puts in the story for why Israel's euphoria should be fleeting is that apparently Israel had to kill hundreds of Palestinians to rescue 4 hostages. So why would Israelis feel bad about that? Like, what nation would not be willing to kill hundreds of members of an enemy for the opportunity to rescue 4 members of their own team? And so Hamas chooses to keep these hostages in a residential area, and Hamas chooses to associate and to try to blend in with the civilian population. And so when Israel fights to take back its hostages, there are civilians who are killed along with Hamas fighters. And why would Israel feel bad about this? Palestinians in general, Gazans in particular, have made very clear that they seek the total destruction of the Jewish state. And they proved it by, they elected Hamas, right? Hamas is in power, right, in Gaza because the Gazans elected Hamas. They chose Hamas. Opinion polls showed that Hamas's October 7 attack meets with overwhelming approval by people in Gaza. So why would Israel not be down with slaughtering their enemies? And why would that be considered like something that they would feel bad about? And here's another shocking revelation from this New York Times article. The audacious operation did little to resolve the many challenges facing Israel's government. Oh my God, that's shocking. What the heck is going on with myself? I would have expected that this hostage rescue would have solved all of Israeli government problems. It's stunning. It's shocking. It's amazing to realize that it hasn't solved all of Israel's problems. My God. And then we've got Nahum Barnea, is probably the most prestigious Israeli columnist with mainstream journalists overseas, such as Tom Friedman. He wrote May 26th that Israel's incursion into Rafah won't save Israel. So I just put won't save Israel into Google News, and there are just dozens of results for won't save Israel. Shocker. Who could imagine that there is no one single act that will save Israel? Guess what? There's no one single act that will save you. There's no one single act that will save me. All right? Salvation is an ongoing process, right? There's not one thing that's going to save us. Right? I'm not a Christian, and so I don't believe that salvation descends from above, and those who give themselves to a particular theology then automatically get saved to the next world, which is much, much better. Well, on this fallen world, to use Christian terminology, right, salvation is not something that is dispersed one time and then you're set for life. For individuals, for nations, for states, right, salvation is an ongoing process. There's never one action that saves you. Right. The idea that Israel should be feeling sad or disturbed because they had to kill hundreds of members of the enemy to rescue their own hostages, or that Israel should feel bad because this audacious rescue did not solve any of the Israeli government's problems is absurd. Who on earth would expect that this would save Israel, right? There's no one act that will save Israel. It's just so tempting to think, oh, this one dramatic gesture, that's just going to save us. Well, there's never one dramatic gesture, one dramatic decision that will save you, right? This is Dan Senor, his podcast, Call Me Back with Dan Senor. Here he is talking to Haviv Gur, an Israeli journalist.
Israel can't move a large number of Palestinian civilians safely. We were told that Israel doesn't have a plan. They don't have the capability. No army in modern times has moved that size of civilian population that was so concentrated, so dense, out safely. And the administration kept saying Israel can't do it, Israel can't do it, Israel can't do it. And then Israel does it. And they move something like 900,000 people in a matter of 10 days. So what actually happened there?
Yeah, it's now over 1 million. American officials, in their warnings about Gaza, unfortunately, I don't know how else to say it, have demonstrated real lack of knowledge and lack of competence. The Americans and the Israelis, the two national security councils, and I think you've talked about this recently. They met about 6 weeks ago and they had this discussion. And in the discussion, the talk was the Americans said, to move 1 million people out of the way so you can fight in Rafah will take you 4 months. And the Israelis said it'll take 4 weeks. And it turned out the Israelis were padding the time. And just, Rafah is 5 square miles. In American terms, you would talk about it as a small suburb. How 4 months is just an astonishing amount of time it felt like, American officials have on their wall a map of Russia and a map of Gaza. And since the maps are the same size, they may be in their mind sort of unconsciously developed a sense of size for Gaza that just doesn't make sense. It's not 4 months, and the deed is already done. Not only that, but on the issue of moving civilians, one of the really remarkable things in Rafah, everybody's focused on whether the Americans are right or the Israelis are right. And of course, it turned out that just logistically, the Israelis had a much better sense of how Rafah will go than anything the Americans were saying. By the way, I think that this is a profound critique of the Israeli leadership, because if they'd just gone forward with it 3 months ago, instead of pussyfooting around and waiting while Palestinian civilians live in tents, reliant on foreign aid, and while the soldiers are sitting there in Gaza motionless, and while everybody's, hand-wringing and not getting the job done in Rafah so we can turn that page and move on and get to better times, those 3 months of delay had no reason, no cause. They were massive American pressure based on deep American misunderstanding. And that's very frustrating to me because the Israelis should have cut through it, 4 months ago. Putting that aside, one of the really interesting things to come out of this is how willing Palestinian civilians have been to move, to get up and walk, which means two things. First of all, it means they believe that there will be aid where they're going.
So the Palestinian civilians weren't always so willing to get up and move, right? They became willing to get up and move when they increasingly saw that what Israel was saying is exactly what was going to happen. So when Israel established credibility, then the Gazans became much more willing to get up and move.
Because the aid has come, and it's massively coming in. The push down the Philadelphia corridor, down the border.
Just for our listeners to understand, the Philadelphia corridor is at the border between Egypt and Rafah.
Right, and that border is perforated by 40 tunnels at least that have been used by Hamas throughout the war to smuggle weapons.
In the lead up to the war, in the last 15 years, presumably some parts of the 15 years leading up to October 7th, to get infrastructure in, to get cement in, to get supplies, to get RPGs, to get everything.
Right. Well, a lot of that came in legally, right, in agreement with all the various parties and came over the land. But anything that didn't come over land could just come through the tunnels for a little bit of a bribe to the Egyptian officials. And as Israel's moved down to take the Philadelphia corridor and start to destroy those tunnels, the Egyptians had an apoplectic fit in which they joined the South African ICJ case against Israel for genocide. All kinds of these just ways that they wanted to make, right, Egypt, which sat quietly for 8 months, now believes there's a genocide because of probably the gentlest and also lowest death toll part of the Gaza war yet, right? It's about them showing Israel their displeasure that they're shutting down those tunnels, which are a major source of corrupt money to the Egyptian military elite. And not just the Egyptian military elite, but also the tribal confederation that the Egyptians have established in Sinai that basically run the Egyptian side of Rafah. So,
well, but Haviv, it's not just shutting down that commerce. It's also, I think, my sense is what the Egyptians were flipped out about was it also exposed Israel going in there exposed what's been going on in the years leading up to October 7th, because Egypt has eluded a lot of the pressure and scrutiny since October.
Yeah, this is key. All right. Israel is eluding pressure and scrutiny for the way it facilitated the massive importation of armaments into Gaza that enabled the October 7th attack on Israel.
October 7th, of their working relationship with Hamas. They just haven't gotten that much. It hasn't gotten that much of attention, and makes me now wonder whether or not what Egypt was really worried about was once Israel shows up in Rafah, it's going to put a spotlight on what's been going on at that border. And again, not just over the last few months, but what's been happening at that border in the years before October 7th. And Egypt suddenly would, it's not a good look, shall we say, as my kids would say. It's not a good look for Egypt.
I don't know if that's the problem for the Egyptians. I don't know if they care about the look. First of all, because Egypt's not that well run and hierarchical and disciplined of a state. It's basically a failed state at this point in all kinds of really important ways. Economically, the military is living off of an economy that is.
There is this long-time human rights activist who's Jewish, who's come out and called Israel's war on Hamas to be genocide against Gazans. So let's see if I can find it.
Israel faced a tough week as the International Criminal Court requested arrest warrants for 3 Hamas leaders and for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. All of them responsible, its Chief Prosecutor Karim Khan said, for crimes against humanity. The International Court of Justice, a UN body also based in The Hague, said Friday that Israel must halt its offensive in Rafah, although its decisions are not binding, of course. That ruling was part of its ongoing hearing on whether Israel is guilty in its war on Hamas of genocide against the Palestinians. My guest is Aryeh Nair. He is a giant in the world of human rights and a survivor of genocide himself. He was born a Jew in Nazi Germany. He and his parents escaped Berlin 2 weeks before the start of World War II. He went on to study at Cornell and then to co-found Human Rights Watch. He was at the forefront of the movement to establish the international tribunals, which eventually became the ICC and the ICJ. He's also the former head of the ACLU and the author of many books. He wrote a powerful piece in the New York Review of Books this month on the situation in Gaza. Thank you for joining us.
Very glad to do it.
Your name, Aryeh,
Yes.
is Hebrew.
It's a Hebrew name. It means lion.
Why did your parents give it to you?
Well, my parents were Zionists, and they wanted to give me a Hebrew name, even in Nazi Germany.
All the time you were head of Human Rights Watch, you, I think, only one time accused a country of genocide.
Yes.
Saddam Hussein's
Yes.
attempt to eliminate the Kurds.
Come on, man. Bloody hell. I'm trying to run a show here.
So when you say in this New York Review of Books piece that you have
Okay, only one nation has committed genocide in the past 40 years. Interesting.
concluded that Israel is guilty of attempting genocide,
Yes.
that's a very heavy charge.
Yes.
What is the principal reason you say that?
Well, first let me say that when the South African case charging genocide was initially brought, I was not one of those who endorsed South Africa's argument of genocide. I didn't endorse it because I thought Israel had a right to retaliate against Hamas, and I thought Israel had a right to try to incapacitate Hamas so that it would never be able to do anything like that again. But I was disturbed by some of the actions of Israel, by the use of very large weapons, 2,000-pound bombs, which are utterly inappropriate in a crowded urban area.
Well, they're entirely appropriate for fighting an enemy who is tunneled under the ground. So is the purpose of war to follow the rules, or is the purpose of war to create safety for your team by destroying the enemy's capacity to hurt you?
A bomb like that can kill somebody 2 football fields away, And using bombs like that was inappropriate in the context of Gaza. But still, I didn't think that Israel was engaged in genocide just because of the effort to retaliate against Hamas, even though I thought Israel went far overboard in the way of its retaliation.
So what changed your mind then?
What changed my mind was that over a period of time, Israel has obstructed the delivery of humanitarian assistance to Gaza. And
so that right there is the essence of his case that Israel is committing Gaza, because at times Israel has obstructed the delivery of certain amounts of aid to Gaza. All right? So Gaza borders Israel. It also borders Egypt. Right? Egypt decides how much aid gets into Gaza through its border with Gaza. So does Aryeh think Egypt is committing genocide too? No. He does not even mention Egypt in this New York Review of Books essay. Why doesn't Aryeh mention Egypt? Because he only cares about glory for Aryeh. He cares nothing about Gazans. He cares nothing about the truth. Right? Human rights attracts showboats like this man, like Aryeh Neir. He wrote an essay for New York Review of Books stating Israel was not committing genocide. It would attract no attention. Right? He would not be asked on CNN. The best way for this man to get on TV is to make flashy pronouncements, right? That Israel is committing the only other genocide aside from Saddam Hussein against the Kurds in the past 30 years. Right? There's one and only one reliable source for human rights, and that is the nation state. Right? The state extends rights to its citizens. All other rights are wishful thinking. So, looking at other news stories, I was curious, do other news stories report how Egypt is restricting aid to Gazans? So, May 13, 2024, New York Times reports the flow of aid has come to a near total stop, first closed off by Israel and then further restricted by Egypt. Politico reported May 21, 2024, Egypt aid restrictions are complicating Gaza ceasefire negotiations. Aid groups in Gaza say they are running low on fuel and they are unable to get more from Egypt, straining their operations on the ground. It's all stopped, the official said, referring to Egypt's shipments through the Kerem Shalom crossing. The move by Egypt has sparked tensions between Cairo and Jerusalem. If Israel were to restart the shipments, it would significantly improve the aid situation on the ground. Diffuse tensions allow for peace talks to restart. Cairo is withholding the fuel to complicate Israel's ability to aid the humanitarian effort inside Gaza. Right? The fuel is the blood of the response, says the director for Gaza for United Nations RWA, the main aid group operating in Gaza. The lack of fuel forces us to choose, do you keep bakeries running or hospitals running or the sewage pumps running? Axios reports May 24, under U.S. pressure, the Egyptian government agreed to resume the flow of aid trucks to Gaza through Israel. Why it matters. The Egyptian decision 2 weeks ago dramatically reduced the amount of aid entering Gaza and exacerbated the humanitarian crisis in the Palestinian enclave. So if Aryeh Nair cares about the plight of Gazans, why does he not mention the role that Egypt plays in their suffering? Right? If Gaza is indeed an open-air prison, and that's a vast hyperbolic statement, then Egypt is equally responsible for that. Yet I put Gaza open-air prison into Google. None of the first 10 suggestions from Google is Egypt. Right? The idea that Egypt plays a role in the welfare of Gaza just doesn't come up. Right? Google only suggests Israel as the cause of Gazan suffering. Right? Nothing there about the role that Egypt plays.
Is basically robbing an economy that's in full collapse. The Egyptian population is growing faster than the food supply can grow. With the closure of the Suez Canal to a lot of foreign shipping because of the Houthis, a huge source, something like 40% of all foreign income to the Egyptian economy, or at least through the Suez, which was the major foreign currency income to stabilize that economy, has disappeared. Egyptian society is slowly Islamizing. Female genital mutilation is up to something above 80% of the population now, which is a deeply conservative sort of desert tribal ritual that has moved in from rural Egypt into urban Egypt, riding the Islamist sort of infiltration into urban society. We're talking about a country that in every measure is in full-blown collapse on the way to becoming like Somalia. And so The Egyptian anger at Israel over taking the Philadelphia corridor has a lot to do with the fact that Egypt is turning into a failed state, and the forces that be on the other side are watching their main source of money. Qatari dollars go to Hamas. Hamas buys things through those tunnels. If we take Philadelphia, we cut that source off. The point is that in their anger, the Egyptians did something much more important than accuse Israel of genocide suddenly. The Egyptians actually stopped all aid from coming through Rafah. It's a curious thing that not a single pro-Palestinian protester or government or official thought that was a problem, but to punish the Israelis.
Right. If you don't think that Egypt cutting off aid to Gazans is a problem, then you don't care about Gazans and you don't care about truth. Right. You only care about a particular agenda that you have against the Jewish state. Sam from Israel posts in the comments, Egypt has used Hamas as their proxy. The petrodollar agreement ends today. So let me go back to some further reporting. Why does Google and why does the news media continually suggest that the sole cause of Gazan suffering is Israel? Right, there are four sides to Gaza. You got two sides that border Israel. You got a side that borders Egypt, and you got a side that borders the Mediterranean Sea. Right, the Israeli government prevents people from Gaza entering Israel. The Egyptian government prevents people from Gaza entering Egypt. What's left is the Mediterranean. Israel is doing nothing to prevent Gazans from leaving via the Mediterranean. Right, Israel would love for Gazans to leave, but no country in the world wants Gazans. Why? Why is every country in the world so insane that they don't want the dynamic human potential of Gazans? Because Palestinians have a long track record, and their track record is that they wreck societies that they enter. Right? Gazans have a horrible track record of terrorism. Gazans built their own reputation, and they're dying because of their own creation. They made their bed, they elected Hamas, and they're paying the price for their choices. Right? When Palestinians moved into Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, they severely damaged those societies. They caused massive upheavals in those countries. Name me one society that has been more improved than hurt by the presence of massive numbers of Palestinian immigrants. You can't. Such a society does not exist. Name me one first world country that has been more improved than hurt by the massive immigration of Muslims. Like, which such first world countries have become more prosperous and more free because they admitted millions of Muslims? Like, where has the entrance of large numbers of Muslims into a first world nation raised the average IQ? Right? If the Palestinians are a curse to every society that they move to, why would anyone want them? Now, I don't for a second believe that there's something inherent in Palestinians in particular or in Muslims in general that makes them incompatible with Western civilization, right? There's no inherent quality to Palestinians and Muslims. Like, all of us are a product of our genetics and our circumstances. So when circumstances change, right, Palestinians and Muslims may well change too. You can't leave a prison, but you can leave Gaza, right? Hundreds of thousands of people have left Gaza over the past decade, right? Hundreds of thousands of people have traveled to Gaza and then left again over the past decade. Also, you have billions of Africans and Middle Easterners have crossed into Europe via boats over the past decade. Why do the Palestinians lack this enterprise? So when Egypt ruled Gaza, the conditions were much harsher than under Israel rule, right? Egypt essentially isolated Gaza, refused to integrate the people in it, led to severe economic deprivation. Then in 1967, as a result of the Six-Day War that was thrust upon Israel, the Gaza Strip came under Israeli jurisdiction, and Jewish Israeli settlers settled in it alongside Arabs. And Israel helped Gazans plant over 600,000 trees. And between 1967 and 1982, the economic growth in Gaza averaged about 10% per annum, bringing an unprecedented era of economic prosperity. But rather than continue to prosper economically under Israeli rule, the Gazans launched the first bloody intifada in 1987, resulting in hundreds of Jewish and Arab deaths. Then Israel completely removed itself from the Gaza Strip, right, forcibly expelling over 9,000 Jews from 21 towns in 2005. Israel withdrew from the southern edge of the Strip, known as the Philadelphia Route, handing over full border control to Egypt. I'm reading from the Jerusalem Post here. So you got a new era. Since 2005, Gaza has been self-governing, and you've had an enormous amount of European and Arab aid flow in. In 2006, you had elections in Gaza. Hamas won a plurality. Hamas has had full control over the Gaza Strip since 2007, right? And Gazans weren't deceived by Hamas. Hamas has always made clear their terrorist nature. Their charter calls for the complete destruction of the Jewish state of Israel. So we're often told that Gaza is an open-air prison and that Gazans can't move in and out, right? So September 19, 2023, Palestinian TV broadcast a program called Emigration from Gaza, right? It claimed that over the past 15 years, 250,000 young Gazans had left Gaza for abroad, right? What prevents more people from leaving Gaza is Hamas, right? Hamas bureaucracy and other countries don't want Gazans, right? Just last month, there were violent clashes involving hundreds of young Gazans outside the Salt Travel Agency in Gaza City, authorized to issue visas to Turkey. Right? In a prison, people might try to leave, but it's not usually possible. But if they do leave, do they then return to visit? In July 2022, over 15,000 expatriates returned to the Gaza Strip for the Feast of Eid. Right? They're excited to visit. Right? They wanted to visit. The life expectancy at birth for Gazans is 76 years, which is comparable to its neighbors. Right? So to the extent that Gaza is an open-air prison, right, that's because of Hamas, right? There is one governing entity in Gaza, that is Hamas, and they severely restrict what Gazans can do.
The Egyptians stop aid to Palestinians because the world will come down on Israel, and so the way you punish Israelis is through Palestinian suffering.
Okay,
what's
let's
interesting
get,
about
Sam
that is,
onto the
and
show.
shows you how well the
Sam
war
from Israel, what's going on, man?
Hey, how are you there? Nice to meet you.
Yeah.
Ford, what's
Yes.
the name?
Yeah, Luke Ford. Great to talk to you, man.
Luke from Star Wars, right? Luke.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, you know, I'm in Israel. I'm in Haifa, and I have a unique perspective because I've lived in the United States and Israel, equally. But all I can tell you is that if you want an answer for why Gaza is a constant problem that doesn't get resolved, it is because of the Islamic world, the Arab world, openly using Gaza as an instrument of war against us, not just as a proxy army via Hamas, but as a constant a dilemma that is not intended to be resolved. And this is a form of asymmetric warfare that is used against us. They don't want to resolve this problem. The Arab world, the Islamic world, the Muslim world wants this. It's a perfect instrument for them to use without them having to be directly involved. It's a means of undermining the Jewish state, the Jewish demographic, the Jewish population. And this is an obvious truth. This is an in-your-face truth. They even themselves let people understand that that's the case. It's not that they don't want the Palestinians. By the way, the Palestinian population of Gaza, as you said, has been recycled. A lot of them that lived there during the conquest of Gaza by Israel in the Six-Day War in '67. A lot of them have already emigrated outside of Gaza to Europe, to other countries, to Kuwait, Qatar, UAE. And the new population, these are recent Egyptian arrivals that are the refuse of Egypt. And how did they get to Gaza? Via 50 tunnels under the Philadelphia corridor, under the Egyptian border in Rafah. And that, so I hate to use a vulgarity, but they need to stop bullshitting us. It's like we already understand the games, the lies. And it's over. This propaganda game, this misdirection and deception game. These are professional refugees. And by the way, the October 7th massacre. What led up to that was that plenty of mercenaries were smuggled into Gaza that helped train Hamas and prepare Hamas for the October 7th surprise attack assault massacre. And amongst them were Chechens. All right, Chechen mercenaries, Islamic fanatic Chechen mercenaries. How do I know this? The victims at the Nova Festival, a lot of them were witness to the terrorist murderers speaking Russian, and not just one account, several accounts. So you had mercenaries that were smuggled into Gaza. Okay, so this bullshit game is going to end now. We're not going to put up with this.
I didn't know that there were Chechen mercenaries in Gaza.
Oh yeah. They're keeping it pretty silent. A lot of them were, taken care of, disposed of. They were shot dead. But this is being kept quiet. But a lot of the survivors of the Nova Festival and of the assault in the cities surrounding Gaza, it gave first account testimonies to hearing these people speaking Russian, and they were white, they were Caucasian, not all of them, but a certain amount of them, and they were carrying ISIS flags, and they were taking those drugs, the Captagon drugs, the stimulants, just the same way that ISIS operates. So, and and again, I hate to go off like this, but who is responsible for ISIS? It's the United States CIA. It's Obama. And their main headquarters, it was or still is in Ankara, Turkey. The Turks are responsible for allowing ISIS to infiltrate into Iraq and into Syria. So this is a stinking mess for a PR, for public relations with the United States, because ISIS is the handiwork of the CIA. All
Wait,
right?
how is ISIS the handiwork of the CIA? Tell me more about that.
Well, just look at by way of direct relations evidence that the oil that before the United States got involved in Syria, the oil that ISIS was taking out of Syria was going where? In truck convoys straight to Turkey, and the Turks were not stopping them. They were allowing all of that oil that was confiscated or stolen from Syria to enter Turkey. Okay, so they were pillaging Syria and Iraqi oil, and how? Via Turkey. All right, and the training these people got, Chechnya is not very far off from Turkey in the Caucasus over there. It's very close. And all these ISIS people were being trained in Turkey, and they infiltrated into Syria from Turkey. All right, and Turkey's a NATO ally, and Turkey is a NATO member and an ally of the United States, but they're two-faced. They double deal. All right, they double deal all the time. They're mercurial. You never know whose side they're really on. Now that they're with the Russians, and the next day they're with the Iranians. But I'll tell you with absolute confidence that ISIS is a construct and a product of U.S. military intelligence. All right? You could do the research. It's not, they always blame Israel for ISIS, Israeli Secret Intelligence Service, whatever, ISIS. That's bullshit. It was the CIA. It still is the CIA.
And why do you think Hamas was so effective on October 7th?
Because they had help from the entire world. They had mercenaries from all over the world. They had a German expert in Paraguay in the motorized gliders, the parachute, training them. We had a year's worth of reports coming out of Gaza of them training for an assault. And we saw the footage, and how our treacherous media here in the hands of the leftists, or at the time the compromised corporatist leftists in charge of this country, were telling us that there's nothing to worry about, that it's only aspirational. Our intelligence services were saying They were dismissing it, and it's only aspirational, and it's only a display. It's only, they're putting on an exhibition, all right? But in the meantime, they were flooding Gaza with small arms, weapons from Egypt, from the Egyptian military, and donations from the Egyptian people, all right? Grenades, vests, claymores, everything and anything. And our soldiers, once they entered Gaza, they found these small arms in every home, and they found copies of Mein Kampf in almost every home over there. So they were being radicalized, and they were being programmed, and Egypt was complicit. And you had Egyptian munitions, explosives, and straight from the Egyptian military with U.S. markings that the U.S. sold to the Egyptian army. That was being smuggled into Gaza and given to Hamas. Anything and everything was being given to them. It was a long planned operation for over who knows how many years. Long term, they planned this. And how long did it take them to build that whole infrastructure of the tunnels? Years upon years. So this was a case of a betrayal, a case of negligence, a case of criminal negligence on the part of our heads of our intelligence, and compromised military officers that are in the hands of American intelligence agencies and the American economic interests that keep us marginalized, that marginalize our security here. And we had to learn the hard way now. And we came out looking like chumps, like dupes, victims. We were victimized to this, it seems very complicated. It seems very convoluted, but it's not. This was, in my opinion, if you want to ask me, this was the fulfillment of the prophecy of Ezekiel 38 in a very esoteric way, but a full manifestation and full fulfillment, because you had many different nations involved, many different backstabbers involved, including the CIA, including Obama. Okay, this is a combined effort that made October 7th possible. And you had traitors from within. And if you read it in the prophets, you read it in Ezekiel and Zechariah and all of them, when it talks about the end times, it talks about Jewish traitors. It talks about members of the Jewish faith, of the Jewish nation, betraying Israel in the end times, and that was fulfilled on October 7th.
So who do you primarily blame in the Israeli establishment for the debacle of October 7th?
Ehud Barak, number one suspect, the guy who fled the same day. He was in the airport, caught running away, and he still hasn't returned to Israel. He still hasn't shown his face here. He's the number one suspect, primary suspect, but you had the heads of our intelligence agencies that also stood down or totally neglected the severity and the seriousness of what happened. And you had a traitor that was caught, an officer, an IDF officer that was not stationed in the outposts of the Gaza Strip, but went there anyway, infiltrated the outposts and gathered a lot of intelligence, and it got into the hands of Hamas one way or another. And our Attorney General, Meira, covered it up. All right, the guy was arrested, investigated. He's still sitting in jail, and she put out a sort of an order to keep the investigation secret, to censor it, to not allow it to be publicized to the media. One of our ministers, right-wing ministers in the Knesset, actually started speaking out about this, and she tried to have him arrested, and she started slandering him. All right, so you have a left-wing establishment here that's in the pockets of the United States and of secret societies in Europe and in America, the Freemasons. This all came about also as an attempt to stop and block the Supreme Court reforms the justice reforms. And guess what? The same week that October 7th happened, a few days afterwards, the nerve of our Supreme Court to overturn the legislation that passed to reform the Supreme Court's power over the Knesset. So they're very suspect. We have a fifth element that's compromised, that's in the hands of European governments, America, and secret societies in Europe and in America that keep us marginalized here. And the cat is out of the bag. And the milk has been spilled. It will never go back in. Israel is awake. The Israeli public here is awake to this now. It's no longer theory. It's conspiracy, 100%.
Now, Israel's Supreme Court has some pretty wide powers. They can essentially strike down any law that they regard as unreasonable.
Correct.
Which is stunning.
Correct. It's not a democracy. It's a dictatorship via the judiciary.
So I can understand why Netanyahu would want to reform and revise that. So why on earth should a court have the power to appoint its own members and then strike down any legislation that the court thinks is unreasonable?
But you just have to look at the architecture. I don't mean to take it off on a different in a different direction. You have to look at who donated the building, the fact that it sits above the Knesset in altitude, it hovers above the Knesset. It was donated by the Rothschild family, and it was built by a Rothschild architect and designer that they wanted to distance themselves from. They said that it was some sort of lottery. They wanted to make it seem as though it was an organic thing, and the architect was chosen by lottery. But guess what? This architect decides to build the whole building in the style of a Freemasonic mystery religion temple. And I'm sorry, that's not ridiculous. That's the case. This has been outed. This has been totally exposed, and it's in our faces, and they think we are dumb. They think we are stupid. The Supreme Court building in Israel is Freemasonic in style and architecture, and in essence, with the judges there and the powers that they give themselves, and it's not by mistake. It's not a mistake. All right, so they duped us, and we thought okay, let's go along with it. The Rothschilds, they're Jewish, and maybe it's good for Israel, but it's only good for the elites. It's only good for the leftist, sellouts, the cocks that sell us out, that sell out our security, that sell out our, sovereignty, that want to fight at every turn and every corner the Jewish identity of the Jewish state of Israel. They don't want it to be a Jewish state.
So, who do you admire in the Israeli political landscape?
Right now, I am Mizrahi, so I'll go with Ben Gvir. I don't like Shas. I don't like Deri. I think they're a corrupt organization, a corrupt political party, and they're cynical. And the fact that Deri is renting apartments to Eritrean infiltrators in southern Tel Aviv to make money off of them, it just speaks volumes about him. He's a corrupt politician. I don't trust him. I don't like him. I don't admire him. I do admire Ben Gvir, and I do like the right, extreme right, religious right. I'll still support Bibi Netanyahu, but I realize now that if I don't support the nationalistic right-wing parties, then I'm being just a total jerk or a sucker.
And how long have you lived in Israel?
I was born here, and I came back in 2005. Okay, I left Israel when I was a boy. My parents took me to live in New York, in the United States. Okay, so I've lived half my life in the United States and half my life in Israel, in Haifa. And so I served in the U.S. military and the Israeli Defense Forces. So I have a unique perspective. I'm not the only one. There are a lot like me, but I could see both sides of the aisle. And I'll tell you that we have been played by the British Freemasons, by Europe, by England, and by the United States. The petrodollar compromised our security for 50 years. This is why Gaza seems to be unresolvable. It's deliberately unresolvable, okay? This could have been resolved a long time ago. The problem is that power elite don't want it resolved. They want us compromised. They want this permanent dilemma, this permanent burden on our backs. It's deliberate.
So how effective do you think Israel is in fighting back against Hamas?
Well, now, because they gave us no other choice, I mean, we were in a stupor, and we were, prior to October 7th, we were, the country here was mesmerized. The country here was in a haze. And we had this, hippie culture thing going on here. The LGBTQ plus P plus B plus all of that. We were playing along with that to cater to the West, to cater to Europe, to cater to America. It weakened us. It blinded us, just like Samson. And but now, after we got smacked, raped, butchered, our children, in their homes, even the leftists don't have any excuses for not fighting back. So all of our empathy, all of our humanity and feelings towards the Palestinians has been erased. We don't care how many casualties there are there. They are fully responsible for their casualties and for their suffering right now. So we are effective in fighting them. We won't denazify them. We won't de-radicalize them. If they're talking about a long-term plan, just like what happened in Europe, that took a long time to denazify Germany. That wasn't, fully, effective. Believe me, I know a lot of Germans, and young Germans, that today are, hailing Hitler again. I can try to understand them with what's being done to Germany, and they're turning radical, right, extremist and everything. But the problem is that you have the oil interests, the moneyed interests, the economic interests. It's all interwoven into Israel's politics and our ability to defend ourselves. We get marginalized by our patrons, like the United States or even England.
So how concerned are you about Hezbollah? Like, you're in northern Israel, Hezbollah's in southern Lebanon, firing rockets into northern Israel.
I lived here during the Second Lebanon War for 2 months. I was in bomb shelters, and my neighborhood was shelled, and people I know were wounded, and not people I know killed, but a lot that I knew. There were a lot that died and were killed, but I know people personally that were wounded. And we were marginalized. Our army was weakened. Our fighting spirit was weakened. But Israel now has received such a traumatizing shock after October 7th that even if Joe Biden and Obama and Blinken and the Bolshevik, neocon, atheist, progressive, Jews in his administration want to pull the reins on us and hold us back, they can forget about it. That's why I said the petrodollar has died today, and good riddance to it. And America is going to have a huge fall, and it'll fall on its head, just like Humpty Dumpty, and he'll never be put together again, back together again. And this goes for Europe and their banking system. America and Europe, their banks are about to fail. It won't take that much longer.
Wait, why do you say the petrodollar is dead today? Petrodollar means U.S. dollars paid to an oil exporting country.
Correct. Saudi Arabia signed an agreement 50 years ago, almost to the day, June 6th. It's all over the internet for a 50-year long contract that ends today, and they're not renewing it. All right. They have gone with the BRICS nations. They've entered into an agreement with them with their digital currency backed by gold and now by oil. All right. Hyperinflation or massive inflation is about to hit the United States. The Jews of America will get a terrible humbling soon. Terrible humbling. And it's from God. And they will come to Israel broken, humiliated, and defeated. Because if they don't want to come here by virtue of their senses and their free will, they'll come here against their will.
So how's your own mood? Are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic for Israel's
future? I'm
optimistic
because after October 7th, they leave us no choice. We will utterly flatten Beirut. Utterly. If they start bombing and shelling Haifa or Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, we should be doing this now. But we're, playing along with the Americans, with Biden. Biden is the one holding us back. And who's behind Biden? Obama. Obama is who? Obama's CIA. Okay? And so the thing is, we'll play along as long as America has some say and some power and some influence and some leverage over us. But America is about to be taken down. All right. And they'll leave us no choice. It'll be, no holds barred against Hezbollah. And we will use everything in our arsenal to destroy them, excluding nuclear weapons.
So how did you develop your understanding of the world? Were there any bloggers or people on social media or podcasts that were influential over you?
Yeah, especially, I'll name them. First and foremost is Alex Jones in Austin, Texas, okay, Infowars.
Mm-hmm.
Second, I'd say, is Jim Willie. He lives in Costa Rica. He is an American expat, and he's an economic analyst and a statistician. Jim Willie, I look for him a lot on the alternative media. Thirdly, I'd have to say the ones that come off just off the top of my head. I'd say it's Zero Hedge, the site.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Zero Hedge. They provide a lot of alternative media that is accurate. And let me see. I'll just look at my favorites here just to have it pop into my head. Oh, you could talk about Greg Hunter's USA Watchdog. He interviews a lot of figures that provide contrarian information to the mass media. Greg Hunter, USA Watchdog. That's another good one. And let's see who else. Who I always refer to. 1 minute. I'll find him. I have him saved in my favorites.
Sure.
In my bookmarks and everything. Believe it or not, even though I despise them for the most part, because they are state-run propaganda, it is Russia Today, Russian television. I want to listen to them for contrarian views to the Western mass media. Not that I go along with their bullshit, because they are pro-Palestinian. Because why? Because the KGB helped found the PLO, it turns out. And they helped, establish Yasser Arafat. He was one of their, it turns out, one of their creations, one of their agents. He was actually, sponsored by the KGB and trained by the KGB in the 60s. Why? Because Israel turned more to the West than it did towards the Soviet Union. Israel was hand in hand with the Soviet Union in its founding.
Yeah.
It was socialist.
Yeah.
And then in the 60s, Israel, the government here had a change of heart and decided to turn its I wouldn't say loyalties, but it's a alliance towards the West more than towards Russia. So Russia was butthurt and decided that it'll undermine Israel via this ruse of the Palestinian state, the PLO, and Yasser Arafat. It was their movement. It was their agenda. Okay, that's why they are so pro-Palestinian. That's why their propaganda is so pro-Palestinian.
Now, do you think that Israel's committing genocide in Gaza?
Absolutely not. Why weren't claims of genocide cast upon the United States in Iraq, in Fallujah, in Mosul, and everywhere else? They carpet bombed Iraq, killing millions, 1 million plus people, 500,000 children. Why weren't accusations of genocide cast upon the United States? I'll tell you why. Because they're the big dog. They were the big dog. They are the ones in control of the mass media and commercial, corporate media. So they decide the narrative. They construct a narrative. So the Russians realize that information warfare is just as vital and important as actual kinetic warfare. That's why they created Russia Today online and around the world. They realized that's part of the game. So Israel also slowly understood propaganda and information warfare and Hezbollah and all this. It's like, but we're not as loud and effective as the Americans or as the Russians or as the Europeans. So we get accused of genocide. Why do we get accused of genocide? Because the Gentile world wants to cast off the yoke of Holocaust guilt. That is the main purpose of accusing us of genocide when it's self-defense.
So how would you compare the quality of life in Israel compared to the quality of life that you knew in the United States?
The quality of life in Israel is far greater than it is now in New York or in the United States. The United States is rotting visibly, and it will continue to fall apart and rot. Okay, it's God's will in order to bring the Jews back to Israel against their will, because they're not listening to him. That's what ultimately is happening right now.
So what goes into what gives Israel a high quality of life? I assume there's some sense of social cohesion, that there's greater safety than in New York, for example, that there's less violent crime.
There's no fluoride in the water. We're not being chemically attacked through our food and water. I mean, the chemicals in America's food and water make the health issues in America chronic and really severe. All right, Americans are not healthy people. All right, Israel is more like Eurocentric, and the Europeans are also health-minded. So a lot of Israelis are far more health-minded and aware and sort of engaged in health, in personal health, and also in well-being, and in solving the problems of the that plague the Western world, but especially the United States. Americans, when you look at them compared to Israelis, they look unhealthy. They are unhealthy.
I particularly noticed that among the women, that Israeli women are far fitter and tighter and thinner than their American counterparts.
Yes, and America has been hit multi-front, and it's done by their elites. It's for the sake of pharmaceutical monopolies, medical industrial complex, to keep Americans sick. It's a part of their business model. All right, it's not a joke. The food and the water and the lifestyle over there and the culture is meant to keep you sick. They want people sick. It's profitable for them, for the American people, to be sick.
Okay, Sam, I'm going to move on. Any final words for today?
Yeah, well, this will be resolved. Hezbollah will be taken care of. America is about to have a terrible fall, and the European banking system in Europe is also going to have a terrible fall. And it's apocalyptic in its end times, and it's messianic, and I believe in it 100%. Israel will be the safest place for the Jews, and it will be the center, the magnet, and all the Jews will come here, and no one will harm us, no one will threaten us. And the opposite. Okay? That's my final say.
Okay, thanks, Sam. Great to talk to you.
Take it easy.
Take care, man. Bye-bye.
Has gone on the ground now in the last few months, or certainly this month, is that did not affect aid. There's so much aid coming in now, and coming in from so many places. There are actually brand new border crossings between Israel and Gaza to facilitate the aid, that Palestinian civilians are absolutely convinced that if they go somewhere the Israeli army tells them, there will be aid there.
Okay, I want to get to the Biden-Israel proposal, or the Israel-Biden proposal. Before we do, just one caveat on that. Everything you're saying makes sense to me, except for the reality that we still think there's something like 350 miles of tunnels underground. There are still Israelis being held hostage underground. Hamas knows how to maneuver within these tunnels and can get from one part of Gaza to another part of Gaza in twists and turns underground that the IDF...
So this Dan Senor podcast was recorded approximately June 1st, so about a week ago.
So far, my understanding, can't really keep track of or make sense of or navigate. So on the one hand, there's this incredible progress that you're describing. On the other hand, there are these structural issues, literally this underground labyrinth that Israel really doesn't understand and is probably booby-trapped to the nth degree. And, Israel doesn't want a situation like it's had, like in Operation Protective Edge in 2014, where they go down into a tunnel and a lot of IDF soldiers get killed.
Okay, Nahum Barnea, probably the most prestigious Israeli journalist, according to the most prestigious non-Israeli journalists such as Tom Friedman. And he has been a big opponent of going down into Rafah. And he said Israel must stop the invasion of Rafah. And if Israel had indeed done what he said, then this hostage rescue would never have occurred. So May 26, Nahum Barnea wrote, "The military incursion into Rafah must be stopped, not because the International Court of Justice ordered it, but because the cost outweighs the benefit. We can debate for days the judges' motives, their integrity, their judicial rigor, but it won't save Israel." So, yeah, I put "won't save Israel" into Google News. I get dozens of results. So who will seriously argue that any one act will save Israel? Right? Get a little bit more from this big human rights activist who says that Israel's committing genocide in Gaza.
Those who have been most severely victimized are not the members of Hamas. Men with guns ordinarily find a way to get food and to get fed. But it is young children who are most severely damaged by malnutrition and who will either starve to death, or if they survive, they will be diminished for the rest of their lives, diminished physically.
Wow, these photos of malnutrition and starving, I honestly, I have not seen them before. They are horrifying. And if you are upset by them, as would be a normal, natural human reaction, then you'd have to be equally upset with Egypt.
And psychologically, by the severe malnutrition they are enduring as children. And I thought that severe obstruction of the delivery of humanitarian assistance amounted to genocide.
The Israeli case is multifold, but let me suggest one angle that I've heard people take.
Okay, let me play a little bit more from this podcast with Dan Sainor and Haviv Rettig Gur.
Hundreds of thousands of IDF soldiers have gone into Gaza, walked through buildings, walked over tunnels. Many thousands, I don't know how many, have gone into tunnels at this point. You have an example from Jabalia from 2 weeks ago. As they first went into Jabalia, very quickly there were some elite units that went deep into a tunnel. And there was one running gun battle in which the battalion commander of the Khan Yunis battalion, Hamas doesn't have a whole lot of battalions with command.
So the main argument that I hear for why Israel should stop its war in Gaza is that it is creating too many civilian casualties. And I'm just trying to think, how many wars have stopped short of their objectives because the winning side starts worrying that they're creating too many civilian casualties among the enemy? Right? I can't think of any examples. Did the United States or the Soviet Union pull back from their wars with Nazi Germany because they worried they were creating too many German civilian casualties? I can't think of a single example where a country has launched a war, is winning a war, and has certain objectives for their war, but they stop short of their objectives for the war because they're concerned about the number of dead civilian casualties among the enemy. That just doesn't happen. So why on earth would Israel be any different? Right? Israel has objectives. They want to create a safe state for Israelis. And that's why they will keep on fighting until they achieve their objectives. The number of civilian dead among the enemy should not logically, rationally be thought persuasive to Israel.
Infrastructure still in place, was killed in a running gun battle inside a tunnel. Israeli forces have shown over the last 8 months that they are an incredible learning organization.
So John Mearsheimer wrote in his 2023 book, How States Think, The Rationality of Foreign Policy, when states believe their survival is at stake, they do not hesitate to kill large numbers of civilians if such murderous behavior will help them avoid defeat or massive casualties on the battlefield. So pretty much every state would be willing to kill 200 members of the enemy, be they civilians or fighters, if that will rescue 4 members of their own team. Right? Britain and the United States blockaded Germany during World War I and starved its civilian population to force that country to surrender. The United States relentlessly firebombed Japanese cities beginning in March 1945 for dropping atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So Hamas does not have the capability of destroying the state of Israel, but given the large number of threats to Israel from Hezbollah and from Iran, Israel feels that it's fighting for its survival. So it doesn't matter that from your perspective, Israel's not fighting for its survival, right? What matters for understanding what's happening is that the prosecuting state here, right, Israel, believes it is fighting for its survival, and the number of civilian casualties among the enemy is irrelevant to fighting for its survival. Now, Israel also has doctrines to try to reduce the number of civilian casualties because civilian casualties are bad for Israeli morale and it hurts Israel's reputation overseas. But there's something more important than civilian casualties among the enemy, and that's achieving a safe state for Israelis. And every nation state would act the same way if it had the ability to prosecute a war to further its objectives, such as to create safety for itself. They're not going to stop just because there are civilians dying among the enemy.
They began the war basically without any clue how to fight it. And that's one of the reasons that Gaza City was such a terrible battle, had such a terrible death toll for Palestinian civilians. And we've talked about this. The Israeli army for basically 40 years has solved every military problem it faced with the Air Force. And so it saw these tunnels and it saw the Gaza City problem and it's tried to solve it with the Air Force. And so you had massive bombardment to try to reach those tunnels at great cost to civilian lives. Civilians also didn't yet understand the Israelis meant it when they said they're moving in. There hadn't quite been an example of the Israeli army moving in. So they weren't quick to leave like they are now. And so a lot of Palestinian civilians were killed. And the tunnels weren't actually destroyed because Hamas built them to withstand Israeli aerial bombardment. Within about 3 weeks, that became clear to the Israeli high command. And a whole new doctrine began to be built in real time as the forces moved through Gaza, so that by the time you got to Khan Yunis, it was a whole different kind of war. These soldiers are maneuvering brilliantly, just in tactical terms, through cities. It's a much more of a ground war than it is an air war. Civilian deaths of Palestinians are way, way down. I mean, an order of magnitude lower. And so if you have in Jabalia in the north, over the last 2 weeks, running gun battles inside tunnels in which the booby traps don't work. The soldiers know how to maneuver through the tunnels, around the booby traps, through Hamas's traps. We're 8 months in, and the IDF has shown how much it can improve facing a new kind of, battlefield built by an enemy that's very clever and very smart and tried to deny it freedom of action. And it built out a whole new way of acting and operating in order to deal with that. So yes, we still have all these challenges. However many tunnels still exist, we think that we've probably destroyed 40, 50%. So it's just a question of time. Because the IDF is so good at what it does, has shown that it can accomplish.
So a large part of the reason for these growing calls internationally for Israel to stop its war in Gaza is this notion of human rights, that there are international human rights, and Israel is violating the human rights of the Gazans. So Gazans are not citizens of Israel, right? So Israel does not need to accord them the rights that it accords its citizens. It would be bizarre for anyone to expect a nation to accord its enemy, right, the same rights that it accords its own people. So human rights have become a hot topic since the 1970s. And why? Because previous left-wing utopias failed, such as Marxism. And so people on the left who wanted to pursue some highly desirous utopian end, they had to give up socialism and Marxism and communism, and they fell into promoting international human rights. Now, international human rights hold no sway. Right, human rights activists have made very little appreciable impact on the world, but they do get a ton of respectful coverage in the news media, and they get a feeling of righteousness, and they get status and prestige. And so that they don't actually accomplish anything is irrelevant when they mainly just want to kind of build themselves up. Right, so let me just create a background for what happens when we deny reality, right? When we're out of touch with reality, we have to develop a defense mechanism.
I think that it would be overwhelmingly psychologically threatening for us to integrate. Our brains learn to repress on our behalves. Now, what would be
So anything that is overwhelmingly threatening for us to integrate, our brains learn to repress. And as a result, we get neuroticism and various, defense mechanisms. So, for example, the fact that different people have different gifts, that is denied publicly in the first world. And so you get compensations and neuroticism for denying this obvious truth, such as the woke movement. And that human rights, the only meaningful understanding of that term is that human rights come from the state and it's something that they can provide to their citizens. Right? That's an obvious blinding truth. People who believe and fight for international human rights, they are denying a basic truth. And so living in a false world creates varying levels of neuroticism.
overwhelmingly psychologically threatening to integrate? Usually, any type of information that would disconnect us when we are very young from our caregivers. So, for example,
So any kind of information, if you give a sentiment, all right, that would disconnect you from the cool people, from the ruling elite and its representatives. If you say something that violates social taboos, all right, that's going to be dangerous for your well-being and your social status.
if your caregivers became very distressed when you were looking for
If other people who are important to you become very distressed when you're stating obvious truths, in all likelihood, you will learn to stop stating obvious truths to people who are important to you if they appear distressed when you impart such wisdom.
emotional support because maybe they didn't know how to give it and that made them feel incompetent. You may have learned very early on, if I show distress around my emotional needs, I get rejected. And to a child, being rejected by your parents gets logged as a survival threat. So what's highly likely to happen is your body is going to start naturally repressing your emotional needs on your behalf.
Okay,
So you
let's
develop
get
a
Claire
blind
Khaw
spot.
onto the show. Claire, anything you've heard that you'd like to comment on?
Yes, thank you, Luke, for having me. You were talking about one act of redemption that would save Israel. And my answer to that would be, I suppose some would call it supernatural, but obviously penitence, sackcloth and ashes for all the wrong, not just the Jews, but also the Christians and also the Muslims have done. It is a religious war that could be settled by honest and rational theological debate. But I find that very few people, even though they claim to be Jews, Christians, and Muslims, they won't talk about, what God might think about the whole thing. The discourse seems to me to be about greater victimhood. So the Muslims, foolishly, as if anybody cared about them, keep posting, do you realize we can be genocided? 34,000 of us, maybe even 200,000. And actually, nobody cares. As Stalin said, one death is a tragedy, a million is a mere statistic, and basically people don't really care about Muslims, particularly those in the West. They wish they would, all not be around to complain about genocide. And I think that is the inability of Muslims to understand the nature of their predicament. As for Jews, I think Sam earlier was making the point that there is some conspiracy. It seems to be that the State Department is deliberately trying to make Jews and Arabs fight each other. And I think there must be some truth in it because Israel serves a very real geopolitical purpose for America. It, after all, has access to the Red and Mediterranean Sea, and it's the American colonial outpost there to keep an eye on its oil and the Arabs who produce the oil. And the other thing I would mention is that Israel has this problem of being perceived to be holy. And because of that, just that very status, it makes people obsess about Jews, in a good way, in a bad way, in a hateful way, in an admiring way. And I think fundamentally, the Anglo-Saxon Empire has used the brand of Jews to weave its post-war narrative, which is that it has assumed the white man's burden of protecting the Jews in the Middle East. And that narrative, the narrative of the Holocaust, is sacred to the Anglo-Saxon Empire, and that is why we cannot question it. Not even Jews can question it. In Israel, Holocaust denial is an offense. I don't know if you've ever heard of the song "It's My Party and I'll Cry If I Want to."
Yes.
And I was thinking, it's my Holocaust and I'll deny it if I want to. And Jews get into trouble too for denying the Holocaust, because I know you're going to laugh at me for saying the one act of redemption for Israel would be the secular Quranism with Israeli characteristics. But even if they wanted to do that, supposing they wanted to do that, they would have to apply to the U.S. State Department for permission to accept Sharia. And I don't think they'll get it from the State Department, because the State Department wants Jews to keep fighting Arabs, because that's the whole point of it.
Okay, so aside from accepting Sharia, what would a day of repentance, what do you think that would do for Israel?
It would make very clear who is the evil empire. You know what the Iranians say about America being great Satan and Israel being little Satan, and saying that the husband and wife, or in that couple who was in, what was it, of Mice and Men, the smart little guy and the stupid big guy who had to be killed, I think, to save him from a prison sentence when he accidentally killed a woman. So I think we don't really know who is the smart one or the stupid one, because it's kind of like a husband and wife relationship. But both parties are trying to gain the upper hand on each other, and they're trying in their own little way to manipulate the other into doing what the other wants. So I think it's very hard to decide which is which, and I don't think it's that important, because the whole narrative of the Abrahamic God is that he divided humanity into Jews and Gentiles, and the further division that we can make is righteous Jews, righteous Gentiles, unrighteous Jews, unrighteous Gentiles, and once we understand these divisions, we can work out which one of us is righteous and which one of us is not righteous. And I'm saying, I've got a simple formula. You just have to be prepared to discuss the no-hike laws, and be prepared to discuss which religion is idolatry. And I'm saying it's Christianity. And obviously there are Jews and there are Muslims who want to form an unholy alliance with the Christians, to fight, the other enemy. So.
Okay, Claire, I'm going to move on. So thanks for stopping by.
Thank you.
Yep. Bye-bye. Okay, so I want to get back to this whole concept of human rights. And there's a great book about it written by Samuel Moyn in 2010 called The Last Utopia, Human Rights in History. And he notes that other historians of human rights approach their subject the way that church historians once approached theirs, right? They regard the basic cause, just as church historians treated the Christian religion, as a saving truth, right? Salvation is here, whether it's brought about by Christianity or by human rights, something that is discovered rather than created in history. So if you can find something in history that can be made to seem like an anticipation of Christianity or an anticipation of human rights, and it's then interpreted to lead that way in the same way that church history famously treated Judaism for so long, as a proto-Christian movement simply confused about its true identity. And the heroes who advance human rights in the world, just like the church's apostles and saints, are usually treated with uncritical wonder. Hagiography, right? The biography of saints, right? For the sake of moral imitation of those who chase the flame becomes the main genre. And this is true of most scholarship about human rights. And so human rights organizations that appear to institutionalize human rights are treated like the early church, a fledgling but hopefully universal community of believers struggling for good in a vale of tears. If the cause fails, it's because of evil. If it succeeds, it's because the cause is just. And so these various approaches in the news media and among scholars, right, provide the myths that the human rights movement needs. Now, in a euphoric mood after World War II, many people believed that secure moral guidance born out of the shock of the Holocaust was on the verge of displacing interest and power as the foundation of international society. But without the transformative effects of the 1970s, human rights would not have become today's utopia. There would be no movement around it. Right? So there is a very clear and fundamental difference between earlier conceptions of rights, all which depend upon belonging to a concrete political community, and eventual notions of international human rights. So prior to the 1970s, the nation state was seen as necessary to create meaningful politics of rights. You know, is there any other real source aside from the authority of the nation state? And the answer is there is not. But if you want to live in delusion and utopia, then you can come up with this international human rights crusade. And it developed out of the distrust of Marxism and conventional left-wing politics, but combined with the desire to have a politics of utopia anyway. So human rights as an international movement largely grew out of Amnesty International, and it began in Christian responses to the Cold War. And then it slowly transformed into a celebrated human rights organization. So its founder was Peter Benenson, and Amnesty International emerged through improvising on earlier Christian peace movements. So Amnesty International wanted to provide a new outlet for idealists disappointed by the result of the Cold War, and after socialism had been revealed as a failed experiment. So Amnesty International began in 1961, and its founder said the underlying purpose of this campaign is to find a common base upon which the idealists of the world can cooperate. It's designed to absorb the latent enthusiasm of great numbers of idealists who have, since the eclipse of socialism, become increasingly frustrated. Right? It is an appeal to the young searching for an ideal. And the effect that Amnesty International would provide to idealists was unimportant. And it matters more to harness the enthusiasm of these idealists and helpers than to do anything in the real world. The real martyrs prefer to suffer. The real saints are no worse off in prison than anywhere else on this earth. So whether or not this human rights activism makes any difference in reality makes no difference to human rights activists. Right? What human rights does is it gives meaning to people. Right? It's a type of engagement that doesn't require much from the person following the cause. Right? Traditional alternatives were dying for hope for some kind of utopia on this life, and so various people wanted to do something to bring about a utopia in this world, and they found a successful formula. All right, you describe some horrible form of torture going on in the world, explain where it's happening, explain the political context in which it occurs, and then end with a plea to show the offending government that the world is watching. So if human rights have made any historical difference, it is in their competitive survival as a motivating ideology in the confusing tumult of 1970s social movements. Right? It became bound up with the widespread desire to drop utopia and to have utopia anyway. But this substitution of plausible morality for failed politics comes at a price. Right? Now it's self-evident that among the major purposes, perhaps the essential point of international law is to protect individual human rights. That's how it's been reconceived. But this is a striking transformation of international law. Right? This is a development after World War II. And one of the more interesting responses to this phenomenon of human rights is the response of philosophers, who, after a few years of confusion about the novelty of this notion of international human rights, then assimilated them to their natural rights principles that they were reviving. And so now philosophers have signed on with this discourse, but that it's completely disconnected from reality has no inhibiting effect for philosophers.
The tasks given to it in Gaza, I think that a lot more of the attention now in the Israeli High Command, even though now we're going to have a whole hostage release and that's going to dominate Israeli politics and media, and President Biden spoke about it, the Israeli High Command is now focused intensely on the north of Israel, on Hezbollah.
Israel's northern border with Lebanon.
Right. The military problem of Gaza is basically solved. It's going to be a long time of a long game of whack-a-mole, like the war against ISIS in northern Iraq was for 5 years. But we know how to do it. And Hamas has been unable, frankly, we talked about how the Americans thought it would take 4 months to move the civilians out of Rafah. The Americans also thought there would be something like 10 times the number of Israeli soldiers killed at this stage of the war. It's kind of amazing that there's so few. That doesn't help close friends of mine who lost a son, in the war. But nevertheless, the Israeli army has proven that it can handle the Gaza war tactically and strategically. And so that's a problem that you just have to put the people who know how to do it on it, and they'll figure it out, and it'll take time. And it's a whack-a-mole with insurgents of the Hamas type, but it's a whack-a-mole that game that can be won.
Okay. I want to talk about last Friday. President Biden, late afternoon, parenthetically, during Shabbat, goes out with a speech, which he rarely does, about what is happening between Israel and Hamas, and does something I thought quite perplexing, which he gives a speech not to announce a deal, but to announce a proposal for a deal. It's just interesting to me. I rarely see U.S. presidents use their bully pulpit to make a plea publicly to the parties to consider a deal or to get momentum behind a deal. Usually the president uses his bully pulpit to put the final touches, if you will, to tie up a deal that's been worked out among the negotiators, to tie it up with a bow and make it public to the world. This, to me, is a political problem, actually, for President Biden, that he looked a little desperate and out of control of events by using his bully pulpit in this way, but be that as it may, let's talk about the proposal. Can you walk through, Haviv, what actually we know of that was announced by President Biden on Friday, and then we'll get into who's for what pieces of it and which parties have different equities. But what is, just so we can establish, so we can talk about it, what is the proposal?
Well, I urge people to just literally read Biden's speech carefully, line by line, because a lot of its internal contradictions become clear when you actually read it, and also a lot of the politics become clear, and a lot of the confusion becomes clear. In other words, you know what you don't know. Biden gave a speech in which he said that there is a hostage release deal offered by the Israelis, which would have tremendous benefits. One of those benefits was that it would create a better day after in Gaza, quote, without Hamas in power. It's a speech that opens with a promise that Hamas will be gone after this deal or as a function of this deal. And then within about 5 sentences, it becomes clear that, in fact, it's a deal in which Hamas apparently remains in power in Gaza. The deal has 3 parts, according to President Biden. Part 1 is a 6-week period of, quote, full and complete ceasefire. It involves the withdrawal of Israeli forces from all populated areas of Gaza. Again, that's a quote, populated areas of Gaza. Apparently that means the Israeli army doesn't have to leave the Philadelphia corridor, which is quite significant, or the Netzarim corridor, which is this piece of land in central Gaza that the Israeli army holds and that bisects, that it has not withdrawn from like it has repeatedly from population centers.
And it divides the north and the south of Gaza, right? It's how Israel sort of stays in Gaza without going into the population centers. It just, they can kind of base operations for the north or the south in the Netzarim.
Right. So a full and complete ceasefire while the Israelis can still hold those areas. During phase 1, Biden said Israel and Hamas would negotiate, quote, a permanent end to hostilities. How is Hamas gone if Hamas is there to negotiate with the Israelis a permanent end to hostilities? The permanent end to hostilities would be phase 2. Right? It would go into effect. There would be a hostage exchange with a full and complete ceasefire for 6 weeks. According to leaks from Israeli officials that I have seen, 33 Israeli hostages would come out. Biden seemed to hint that some of them could be dead bodies and not actually living hostages. If that's an Israeli concession, it's a big one. But 33 hostages, 6 weeks, full and complete ceasefire, while apparently the Israelis can stay in the militarily relevant unpopulated areas of Gaza. Then comes phase 2, which is a permanent end to hostilities negotiated during the 6 weeks of phase 1, an exchange of all hostages, and as part of phase 2, Biden says there would be, quote, Israeli forces would withdraw from Gaza. Then comes phase 3. The war is over, the Israeli army is gone. Hamas is still there. There's nothing that Biden says other than the original promise that Hamas wouldn't be in power to tell us how it wouldn't be in power. Phase 3 is a major reconstruction plan for Gaza, and any final remains of hostages would be returned. He seems to mean all hostages supposed to come out of phase 2. He seems to mean any remains that can't be found in the reconstruction order returns to Gaza, and the last remains can be found. It's really important to him to say Hamas has effectively been destroyed, which is how I know that he thinks that the main Israeli opposition to this deal is going to be that Hamas is not, in fact, going to be destroyed. Quote, the people of Israel should know Hamas no longer is capable of carrying out another October 7. He says that a continuation of the war, quote, will only bog down Israel in Gaza, draining the economic, military, and human resources and furthering Israel's isolation in the world, and it will not bring an enduring defeat of Hamas. That's to people like me, I guess, who think that the military can bring an enduring defeat of Hamas. But if it won't bring an enduring defeat of Hamas, the military, then why would this deal do so, which gives Hamas an out? Hamas negotiates. Hamas is still standing in Gaza the day after. And when you query the text of the speech and you say sort of what will bring about an enduring removal or defeat of Hamas, there is no word about it in the speech. Then he says there will be guarantors. In other words, not to worry. Quote, with the deal, a rebuilding of Gaza will begin with Arab nations and the international community, along with Palestinians and Israeli leaders, to get it done in a manner that does not allow Hamas to rearm. And we can trust the world. Egypt and Qatar have assured me they are continuing to work to ensure that Hamas will...
So one striking thing about liberals in general is how much confidence they have in the power of human reason. And part of that confidence, when it's applied to international conflicts, is a confidence that they can manage these conflicts. But once you get into a war, right, they tend to escalate, right? Fights tend to escalate, wars tend to escalate, and they resist being managed. And so the Biden administration is trying to micromanage the Israel-Gaza war. They're trying to micromanage the Ukraine-Russia war. And it's not working out too well because the Biden administration has unnecessarily placed the United States in the middle of two wars that have absolutely nothing to do with America's vital national security interests, right? Whatever happens in Ukraine, whatever happens in Gaza has nothing to do with the best interests of Americans. And yet the Biden administration has this tremendous faith that they can, micromanage what's happening. I'm reading a book by David Sanger, New Cold Wars, China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and America's Struggle to Defend the West. And he talks about typical Joe Biden, classic Joe Biden, wanting to insert himself into complex disputes half a world away, convinced that his own expertise will make a difference. And there's just no basis for that, right? Since that New Republic article published in the September 1, 1986 edition of the New Republic with the cover headline, Shut Up, Senator Biden, right? Senator Biden is a windbag. He just talks and talks and talks, and he has a vastly exaggerated sense of his own expertise and significance. So Biden, when he was vice president under Obama, would press for all kinds of lethal aid to Ukraine. And Joe Biden said no consistently. So Joe Biden has long led the war for Ukraine, right? He's got a long history with Ukraine. He wanted to lead American support for anti-corruption reforms in Ukraine, right? But what tainted his initiative were the activities of his troubled younger son, Hunter Biden, who made millions of dollars, sitting on the board of a Ukrainian energy company that was also under investigation for corruption. When Obama aides broached the potential conflict of interest with Joe Biden, right, he lit into them, right? So it's the blind spot Joe Biden often has with issues touch his family. And Joe Biden told them to back off. He says, well, look, my son, Hunter Biden, he is an independent adult, and there's no crossover between our work. So Biden has long been a Russia hawk, and he's long supported arming Ukraine. And the more Ukraine armed, right, the more incentivized Russia was to go in and wreck it. And that's exactly what Russia has done. It's gone in and wrecked Ukraine because, in effect, there's no such thing as just purely defensive weapons. Right? You give a country, you give Ukraine defensive weapons, it just makes them a more formidable force on your border and thus incentivizes you to build up your armory so that you can wreck this country that threatens you. Right? If a country has formidable defensive weapons, that means that they are defended from your attack, that they are less vulnerable to you. And if they are less vulnerable to you, that means that they're more of a threat to you. And so defensive weapons don't work in a purely defensive way in international relations.
Fulfills its commitments, the U.S. will help ensure that Israel lives up to their obligations as well. And finally, he says, Hamas should come to negotiate, which to me is the sort of the last nail in the coffin, because it's telling Hamas openly, here's the quote, if Hamas comes to negotiate ready to deal, then Israeli negotiators must be given a mandate, the necessary flexibility to close that deal. Or in other words, everything I have just presented is the Israeli opening position, not even the deal that the Americans actually want to see actually implemented. Now, I have presented this with all of my skepticism all along the way. People, if they want a Chaviv skepticism-free version, should just read it. It's online. It's on the Times of Israel website, the full text of the speech with no commentary. It's a problem, this speech. And it's a fascinating problem. Because in theory, Biden has just made the case that the war can't be won. And since the war can't be won, it's time to cut losses and get the hostages out. And Hamas will remain in Gaza. And Qatar and Egypt and America and Europe and who the heck knows who else will come into Gaza, rebuild Gaza, war's over. Hamas is gone, but is it really gone? We have no idea. We don't know how to get rid of it. Militarily, it's impossible.
So I've embarked on a blog post to try to list off the lies that dominate contemporary discourse. And every time we buy into these lies, they cripple us, right? We develop neuroses around them. We become less effective in life. And here's a bit more of an explanation from attachment specialist Heidi Creed.
Consciously around the fact that you need comfort for your emotional needs. You might truly start believing as you grow up that as long as all of your practical needs are met, that's kind of all you need. You don't think to check in on whether or not your emotional needs are getting fulfilled. Or
Okay, Sam, you jumped back in. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, well, your point about America causing the war in Ukraine is spot on. And if you take an example of what they did in Ukraine, you can apply it not so abstractly to what happened in Gaza. Okay? Except their fingerprints are not as detectable as they are in the Ukraine conflict and sparking that a war off, causing that war. All right? They work clandestinely and underhandedly, but they were more overt in Ukraine. It was more important for them. They didn't care if their fingerprints were spotted, if they got caught red-handed in actually instigating that war and then blaming Russia for it. Okay, but you take that as a model and you apply it to October 7th and Gaza, and you realize their hands are all over that. If they're not the main actors or cause of it, because you had a grander agenda that the Iranians were plotting and planning to have a multi-front attack on Israel, multi-theater from there, from Iran, from the north, from within Israel, from the territories, and from Gaza. That was actually found out through interrogations of top Hamas figures, and we noticed that there was a lot of activity in Hezbollah in the north on October 7th, but they did at the last minute stop themselves from a full-on invasion. They got involved, but they didn't go full tilt, full throttle on us. So The thing is, their hand is involved in both wars, and in igniting and fueling, instigating them, and then trying to manage them. Okay, I'm not pointing my fingers at the American people, at the American military, because they are oblivious to this, just as we were oblivious to the plot that was hatched against us and that was sprung on us on October 7th. These people are nefarious. These people are villains, all right? And they have no concern about how many human lives are lost, how much pain is incurred and caused, and how much suffering. They don't think like that. These people are demonic.
Okay.
Right?
Okay. Thanks, Sam. Okay, let me finish off this point here from
Or
Heidi
let's say
Prieb.
it's the opposite. Let's say you developed a blind spot around your need for independence. Maybe when you were a child, any steps you took towards asserting your independence and becoming a separate person.
Right, when we deny reality, right, when we develop blind spots, right, it makes us less effective in the world, and we then have to evolve defense mechanisms to handle our blind spots.
From your parents felt very threatening to them. And so they would tend to subtly reject you in the areas where you were trying to differentiate from them. What may have happened as a result of that is your brain learned to naturally repress its own desire for independence.
Right, so we naturally repress all sorts of obvious truths about the world around us to fit in with the people who are most important to us. And then this repression of obvious truths, this denial, comes at a price.
So as you grew up, you didn't naturally learn about setting boundaries and differentiating what you want from what other people want. It's an area that you just don't think to check in on. And so what I would qualify as a blind spot is any area of our lives that needs to be attended to in order for us to have reasonably well-functioning mental health, but that doesn't kind of show up when we try to do an audit of what is and isn't working in our lives, because we don't have the conscious awareness that that's an area we need to tend to.
Right, so if something isn't working in your country, in your community, in your religion, or in you as an individual, in all likelihood, you're denying truth, right? You've got a blind spot about some obvious part of reality that for whatever reason, you've evolved a complete denial of the nature of reality in some part of life because reality is just too painful. And this denial always comes at an enormous price.
It's just too much. Let's get it done and let's move on. That seems to be the Biden version of the Israeli offer.
Okay, so I want to try to understand what's going on here, because when I spoke to American officials after this speech, first of all, depending on which American official you talk to, administration official, they had a different take on the speech and its intent, which is interesting. But they kept coming back to, we're trying to pressure Hamas. We're trying to prevent Hamas from trying to retrade at the 11th hour. We want to let Hamas know that this is the last opportunity they have to enter some kind of negotiation. That's our major message. Obviously, the Israeli audience is also part of the message, which we'll get to. But we really want to send a message to Hamas.
So the Biden speech just seemed part of an overall American incompetence in foreign policy that's been particularly striking since 9/11, past 9/11, and the useless invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq.
My reaction to that, Haviv, is if you look at the difference between now versus the first hostage deal that was done late November of last year, when Hamas was under enormous pressure, militarily, diplomatically, there was a sense that pressure was mounting on Hamas in every way, versus the last few months where it has seemed, sort of pre-Rafah, that all the pressure was mounted on Israel, growing tensions between the U.S. administration and the Israeli government, increasing international action against Israel at the UN, different governments around the world, particularly in Europe, recognizing a Palestinian state, U.S. college campuses on fire to the point.
So the point he's making here that just like when you make a claim with an insurance company, they're not eager to give you money, right? You usually have to go to great effort to establish your claim and to provide evidence for it. And so too, when Hamas gives up some hostages, right, it's because they were put in such a desperate position that they saw it as in their own advantage to do so.
that both Khamenei and the supreme leader of Iran and Al-Qaeda are issuing statements of solidarity with American college students, which is like bizarre on so many levels and deeply dark. And so all the pressure was mounting on Israel. And if you want to change, one could argue it peaked with this, the U.S. is now conditioning the transferring of offensive weapons to Israel unless it does what the administration wants it to do. It's not going to send offensive weapons to Israel if Israel's going to go forward with Rafah. So Hamas is not incentivized to negotiate because time is on their side and the world actually is on their side. If you want to change the dynamic and truly get Hamas back to the negotiating table.
Right. A shorter war would have fewer casualties, right? A decisive Israel victory would be the fastest way to reduce the carnage in Gaza. And so the more the Biden administration interferes, right, the more this war drags out with more suffering on the part of Gazans and Israelis.
Then you don't just say what Biden said, which is basically this is the last chance for Hamas to negotiate. This is Hamas's last chance to negotiate. And if it doesn't reach a deal, we, the U.S., are out. Meaning we are out. We're done trying to restrain Israel. We're done trying to moderate. We're done.
And whatever happens in the Israel-Hamas war, it has nothing to do with the welfare of Americans. Right? If Hamas kills Israelis or Israelis kill Hamas or Gazan citizens, on neither outcome is the welfare of Americans changed. Right? Americans will be just the same, right? Whatever happens in the Israel-Gaza conflict inherently, unless the United States involves itself in something that's completely irrelevant to American welfare.
Trying to modulate. We are out. We will continue to supply arms to Israel. Israel have a free hand, free reign to do what it needs to do in Gaza. Goodbye. That sends a message. That would be new. That would say to Hamas, this truly is your last chance. And the U.S. didn't do that. It was more like begging Hamas to come to the table rather than conveying that there are real consequences for Hamas's leadership if they don't come to the table.
And we talked about incompetence. Back in November, Hamas released over 100 hostages because the Israelis had moved into northern Gaza fast, surrounded their northern battalions, and threatened to decimate them. And it was a way to buy 7 days of quiet and rescue what it could rescue. When Hamas has been up against a wall, Hamas released hostages. For months and months and months, the Americans have pressured Israel and been shocked and surprised and dismayed that Hamas walked away from the table. Apparently, the people...
So why will your boss give you a raise? Only if they see it as necessary, right? You get a competing job offer at a much higher rate and your boss wants to keep you, then he'll offer you a raise. But an employer is not usually just going to give you a raise out of the goodness of their heart, right? They're only going to give you a raise if they need to compete with some other option. And so too in personal life, so too in national and international affairs, right? States seek to act in their own self-interest.
People who run American policy on this stuff have never negotiated a deal of any kind over anything. If you negotiate a real estate deal, if you buy a house, if you think the other side is sweating and under tremendous pressure to sell, you wait. And so pressure on Israel pushes Hamas away from the table. I don't understand why that is so obvious and basic. It's a little bit like saying it'll take 4 months to move 1 million people out of a 5 square mile town. It's just a complete misunderstanding of what's happening on the ground. I'll say in America's defense that if you're the National Security Council of the United States or the State Department of the United States government, you're worried about Taiwan and Venezuela and North Korea and Ukraine. And
yeah, and every minute that you give to thinking about the Israel-Gaza conflict, it is a minute taken away from American vital national strategic interests, which may well have to do with Taiwan. So we're getting distracted by things that have nothing to do with the best interests of Americans. Whatever happens in Ukraine, whatever happens in Gaza, it has nothing to do with American interests.
And 1,000 other places and 1,000 other issues, and maybe they just literally don't know that much and just kind of work off a simple playbook.
Also, they have this notion of ideals, liberal ideals. They have this notion of international law and international human rights. And so they're operating American foreign policy in service of abstract ideals rather than the concrete interests of American citizens.
Maybe. But yes, in that this idea that pressuring Israel, and the fact that you then, in the speech, Biden asked Hamas to come and now negotiate what he essentially presented as an Israeli opening position. What a catastrophic way to open negotiations. I don't understand. Hamas will force some concession if you lay out a deal. Now, I think what's happening here, and others have said this over the last 24 hours, is that Biden doesn't trust Netanyahu and believes that even though Netanyahu presented this offer.
Yeah, so Joe Biden here with this speech last Saturday is primarily trying to outmaneuver Bibi Netanyahu. But these fancy games have nothing to do with the vital interests of Americans. All right. I've got an interview here with Dan Schuften, head of graduate program in national security at the University of Haifa and a lecturer at the IDF National Defense College. So he's been a consultant to Israeli decision makers and to the Israeli Prime Minister's Office, Foreign Ministry, Defense Ministry, the IDF, and National Security Council, as well as briefing members of Congress.
Let me give you an example from a different field, and you will see the parallel. Nationalism is a good thing, right? Without nationalism, no democracy, no pluralism, because if you don't have the solidarity of a big group, you cannot be willing to make concessions and to let others have something at your expense, understanding that in the long run, it's even better for you. And the only large-scale solidarity that you have is national solidarity. So nationalism is good. What do you call too much nationalism? You call it chauvinism, fascism, Nazism. And what is the number one enemy of nationalism? Fascism. Because when people see that nationalism could lead to fascism, they assume that nationalism must lead to fascism, the slippery slope, and therefore they become anti-nationalist. And this is what happened to many Europeans until the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine changed it in a considerable way. But the number one enemy of nationalism is too much nationalism, fascism. Now, the number one enemy of liberalism is too much liberalism, called progressivism, because it distorts things by taking it too far. And even the best of things can be taken too far. Transparency is a good thing. You want your government to be transparent, up to a point. Beyond this point,
right, so all virtues exist within a constellation, right? They all have to compete with other virtues. And so all the different political systems and ideologies are ways of adapting to one's environment and circumstances so that you can perpetuate your genes. And if you can't perpetuate your genes, right, if the particular nation can't survive, then it may well have been using a maladaptive political system. And the type of political system that enables your people to thrive in one circumstance is not necessarily going to be the ideal political system for changing circumstances. So there is a time and a place for empire, right? There's a time and a place for nationalism. There are virtues to the liberal world order. You have to understand the circumstances in which you're operating and realize that different politicians and different political ideologies and systems of government are going to work differently depending on the circumstances.
You can never have a serious discussion about anything because people are not speaking to the subject, they're speaking to the protocol. And instead of doing what is good, they do what looks good, what sounds good. So too much transparency can be damaging. For instance, do you want your life basically to be transparent in terms of everyday things? Yes. Do you want transparency in your toilet? Do you want everything in your life to be transparent at the expense of privacy? No. Let's take what we've seen recently in the post-colonial era. Do you want to condemn colonialism? Yes. Was it a bad thing? Yes, understandable at the time, and you must understand it in the context of its time, like you must understand slavery in the context of the biblical era, for instance, but a bad thing that we should fight against. But then the assumption that anybody who's been under colonial rule must be just and pure, and we must support him even if he's a barbarian. And you can have barbarians who were under colonial rule. And there is a difference how people dealt with colonialism. If they make it an excuse to be barbarians, we must be barbarians because we had colonialism, or you cannot call us barbarians because we were under colonial rule, then you
Right. In the real world, people don't care about your past, right? They don't care what you've been through, right? People are going to judge you and judge your people on the basis of whether you help them or if you're a foe. Are you a friend or a foe? Right? People don't care about your sob story.
Going too far. Let me give you another example. I had a confrontation about that in a British university when I said that pluralism must have its limits. So they said to me, what do you mean? If you have limits on pluralism, then it's not pluralism anymore. I said, what about if pluralism is being used in order to destroy pluralism? Democracy must be a self-defending democracy, so that democracy is not used to bring down democracy.
Right. And the way that all functioning democracies work is to have considerable elements of dictatorship which snap into place anytime there's a real or putative emergency.
And they very strongly disagreed with me. And the only way to describe it to them was for me to say, you know what, let's all go for dinner. You want beef, you want chicken, you want vegetarian, you want halal, you want kosher, everything is fine. What about if a cannibal wants to join us? Would pluralism extend to a cannibal joining us for dinner? No. I want to know if I'm on the guest list or on the menu. So there is a limit to everything, and everything good comes from the middle of the political spectrum. And if you go from one extreme to another, and if you take liberalism so far that people realize that it doesn't defend them anymore against barbarians. Let me give you an example because it involved a confrontation that I had in Germany in 2015. I came to the top decision makers in Germany in 2015 and I said, you're crazy. What you're doing by bringing in 1 million or more Arabs and Afghans and Pakistanis, by the way, other Muslims would have been different if they came from India or from Indonesia. It's a different Islam there. But if you bring these kinds of people with their values, with their culture to Germany, you are creating a fascist party in Germany. CSU, CDU used to be as far right as you can go legitimately in Germany. What we have in Germany today, the AfD, was created by Angela Merkel because people who suffer need to have a safe haven, so let us open our gates without limits. Okay, there are billions of people who suffer in the world. If you open the gates of Europe, Europe will suffer like them. And if you allow people to come to Europe and to bring their culture with them, the culture that destroyed their own countries to begin with, the political culture that destroys their countries to begin with, then you're in.
There's probably no more important government policy than deciding who gets to enter your country. If you don't employ strict standards, then the odds are that a lot of destructive people will enter your country, and one destructive person can frequently do things that outweigh the contributions of 1,000 productive citizens. And you are just inviting in chaos if you're not extremely careful about who you allow into your country.
Inevitably pushing people to the other pole.
Now, let me ask you a big picture question. So there's a fear among many other people that I talk to that the success of Hamas on 10/7 triggered the appetite of radical Islam. They view Israel as weak. They see this as an opportune moment to strike and strike again. And an explosion, inflammation in the northern border is only a question of time. It's inevitable. We see that the Iranians were not hesitant to strike Israel with ballistic missiles and so on. Would you agree with that assessment that
So I am a convert to Orthodox Judaism, and on the path of my conversion, I had a great deal of anxiety and insecurity because wherever I went, there I was, right? I took my own insecurity and anxiety with me, and people could palpably sense my insecurity and anxiety, and many of them bullied me and took advantage of me and demeaned me because I kind of invited that. You know, I put out a vibe of, smack me, kick me, knock me around. And so people did. Then when I developed a thicker skin and a more adaptive path through life where I'd be willing to stand up for myself when people would try to demean me, then people stopped bullying me, right? We have a profound effect on how other people relate to us. To the extent that Israel appears weak, right, is going to invite attack. To the extent that Israel appears strong, is going to deter attack. And so Israel prepared the ground for an October 7 attack by its weakness, by its internal division.
the radical Islamic world is looking at this as a moment where they can strike and perhaps even defeat Israel?
Let us go further than your question and focus on the Muslim Brothers. In the Gaza Strip, you had a practically sovereign state of the Muslim Brothers. They behaved in a barbaric way that the Palestinian people support, that the Palestinians in the West Bank support, that the Palestinian people in Gaza support. Okay? At least 70% when you take Khalil Shkaki's public opinion polls. If they can show that they can kill Jews, rape Jews, decapitate Jews, and get away with it, the first danger is in the Middle East. In other words, the Muslim Brothers can take over Egypt. If they take over Egypt, then you have a regional war again in the Middle East. If they take over Jordan, and they are very, very strong in Jordan. Jordan has a terrible public opinion, Palestinians and Muslim Brothers. So they could take over in Egypt, in Jordan, in Morocco, in Saudi Arabia, in the Emirates, in Bahrain. And then the Middle East will erupt into a major confrontation, not only between Israel and the Arab states, but also within the Arab states. And it'll be a calamity. So allowing them to win by whatever excuse you have, and you use human rights for it. Again, human rights became the weapon of the barbarians against civilized people. Not because there's anything wrong about human rights, but because it was prostituted. And what we have is a global process of prostituting the values of civilized society. For instance, if you have an organization like the United Nations, where you have one country, one voice, but the majority of countries are not one person, one voice. In other words, the majority of the United Nations are countries that are either autocratic, theocratic, barbaric, or what have you. Some of them, the filth of the earth. Speaking of the regimes in these countries, North Korea, to give only one example, or Syria, or what have you, and they are the majority. Countries that are not democratic, not pluralistic, are the majority. And the Europeans want to sound good, and they invented something called the international community, which basically comes down to the United Nations. And every international organization is prostituted by the fact that the majority of participants are countries who are not democratic, not pluralistic, not open societies, and they determine what is considered legal, democratic, open-minded. This needs to stop. And you know what? It went so far now with the decision of the court in The Hague that maybe we are at the beginning of the end of this terrible period where the progressives have prostituted liberalism by taking it too far.
So you foresee a pushback?
I foresee a pushback. You know what? I foresaw 3 pushbacks in Europe after 2015. First of all, unfortunately, a counterproductive for liberals who wanted to do it from speaking about liberal values, and then they created the fascists, and they pushed European public opinion to the right, and very often too far to the right, okay? Look at what is happening with fascist parties all over Europe. Now, if parties who used to be fascist are now not exactly to my liking, but no longer fascist, okay, you can live with it. But what you need is to bring the consensus into the middle of the political spectrum. Again, we need to go beyond the Middle East. I'm afraid of Western societies becoming polarized like the American society. I recently spoke to friends of mine in the American Congress, and I told them, I suggest the United States adopt a 2-state solution, a democratic state and a Republican state, because you don't speak to each other anymore. Because some people become cuckoo on the Trump side and the others become cuckoo on the progressive side, and you no longer can reach the kind of compromises that democracy and pluralism are built on.
Now, there's an argument to be made that the same thing is happening in Israel, that the polarization of Israeli, and I agree with your assessment that the good things always come from the center. But there was the famous report put together by the former economic advisor to the Prime Minister, Professor Eugene Kendall, in which he talks about the division between the tribes cannot be fixed because they're not talking to each other. There is no dialogue. What do you think? First of all, I understand you disagree. I would be delighted to hear.
Very strongly disagree.
And what do you think we can do at this point to alleviate that pain?
Look, we have in Israel 3 societies. I think that what the former president said about the tribes in Israel is complete nonsense. But we have 3 societies in Israel. We have Arabs, we have ultra-Orthodox, and we have Israelis, okay? The people who made Israel, built Israel, defend Israel, everything good about Israel are those who are not Arabs or ultra-Orthodox. Now, do you have individual Arabs and individual ultra-Orthodox who support this? Yes, they're my kind of people, okay? My solidarity extends to them. But the hardcore of the Haredi society are a danger to the existence of the Jewish people. The Arab parties and the fact that Arab elites are drawn into the Palestinian political culture, which is destructive, is a major problem. Again, individual Arabs, I have no problem, including Mansour Abbas. No problem with him whatsoever. But if you look at the political hardcore of the Arab society in Israel, unfortunately, and certainly the calamity of the ultra-Orthodox society, these are societies that are separate from the others. I don't think there is a major polarity between right and left in Israel. I don't think they disagree about anything important. We can establish, and we should establish in Israel, a government that can stretch from Meretz to Likud, okay, without Ben Gvir and Smotrich, without the ultra-Orthodox and the Arab parties. Again, individual Arabs, individual people from ultra-Orthodox.
Okay, here's something from Steve Saylor's interview that took place May 13th of this year.
If the anti-white racism is so overt and so intense and more powerful, they begin taking more stuff and causing white people to suffer in worse and worse ways, that inevitably, it's obvious, there'll be a reaction to that. And it could be really, really ugly, right? And so, I mean, do you think that, I mean, it seems like we're on a divergent path between either that outcome, the outcome where nothing happens and just white people are ground under and destroyed, or the third, and I think the most optimistic one, is that people begin to assert themselves. White people do, maybe, and I don't think in an explicit or overt like identitarian way, but rather just reclaiming their heritage and their country and their identity as Americans, and adopting reasonable, which I think the things that you said, reasonable, right? A way of looking at these things, right? So you becoming more mainstream really would be a way out from the two bad options, right?
It seems like a reasonable solution to me. That
So what do you
columnist in the Wall Street Journal or somewhere like that? And,
I think you should replace David French.
All right, but yeah, I quite agree. I mean, we were talking about it a little bit, like in terms of evangelicals and so forth. I mean, what happens when evangelicals get completely disillusioned and turn to more, Nietzschean pagan type views? What happens when people go, oh, we got lied to during the George Floyd thing. So that means we were also lied to about who really started World War II. Must have been.
So Nathan Kofnes is not a big fan of Christian ethics, so he recommends a basis for ethics that is the very Nietzschean perspective that Steve Saylor is concerned about.
And the Jews. And I'm like, no, you watch Faulty Towers. Basil Fawlty explained it. You started it. You invaded Poland. So there are possible, bad outcomes that are being encouraged by all the bad behavior endorsed by and practiced by the American establishment, especially over the last decade, especially over the last 4 years. And some of the things we can do are back off and stop blaming white people for the reasons that blacks shoot each other about an order of magnitude more than whites do. Blacks shoot each other so much more, especially, I mean, if you look at young men, males age 15 to 34, you can look up in the Center for Disease Control Wonder database, and you can look up how often people die by gun homicide. Now, this isn't, they're not measuring who's doing the shooting, but you can kind of guess. All right. Young black men die 6 times as often as young Hispanic men of the same age, and with comparable education level, comparable poverty problems, etc. Young black men die 24 times more than young white men. They die something like 50 to 60 times more than young Asian men. African Americans have a problem with shooting each other. It's a big problem. You shouldn't be surprised by it if you listen to some rap songs. There's a whole culture that's worsened this problem enormously. So what can we? But can we say the truth about that and then not go off into crazy anti-Semitic or other extremist views? God, I hope so. And in some ways, it's more like if you're allowed to say and tell the truth and in general respectable discourse, the realities, that can also keep young men from then going, well, if I'm not allowed to say, repeat Center for Disease Control homicide statistics, that also means the Kennedy assassination must have been by Mossad, and just all sorts of craziness like that.
Well, it's funny because, in our circles, like the evangelical elite, they're always surprised that people like us are reading Nietzsche and stuff like that. It's like, well, if you had allowed us to, read more reasonable people like Vider and Talking Magazine and all these others on the dissident right, then maybe they wouldn't be, in such a state of despair. These establishmentarians in the conservative movement, that are participating in the shifting of the Overton window and keeping it restrained within the liberal consensus. They don't even realize that they're fostering a lot of this frustration among young white men. There was that book recently, Andrew, I don't know if you remember the name, but it was just all about angry young white men, right, in rural America. And it's like, whoa.
Rural white rage.
White rural rage. I mean, they could have named the book just Rural Rage, which is alliterative and short and memorable, but they stuck the white rural rage in there just to let you know that this is a book about why white people are bad.
Yeah, but so why do you think there's so much rage? Because they're getting pissed on all the time, So
well, and I think that's just it. Is that if you make it's the old Chinese story, right? If you make the penalty for being late the same as for treason, right, then you might as well overthrow the government, right? That's it's the same thing where if you make just even what you just said in the last 5 minutes here, Steve, right? If you said that in most evangelical churches, conservative evangelical churches, that and just outline those statistics, they would kick you out. Right? They say, you got to get out of here. You can't be here talking about that stuff, even though it's like demonstrable facts, right? And so young guys see this and they're like, well, if I can't say that, and it's true, then I'm going to investigate everything else, or I'll take the whole bottle of red pills. And so I think, in turning the temperature down, it would behoove, the powers that be to, like you said, not just squish white people under their thumb and drive them to radical ideas. And so, do you think that is going to happen? I mean, like we brought up Jeremy Carl's book, and I think that is an important work that he's done, and it's making its way because Jeremy is a scholar. He's a fairly mainstream guy. He's respected and all of these things. Do you think that the reasonable ideas about dealing with our problems, that there's an opening there, that we're going to have that, or is it going to continue to be this way forever?
Over the years, I've had people come to me, younger people than me, go, "Oh, Steve, good news. Everything is changing because the Washington Post ran a paragraph that admitted, down on page 42." Mm-hmm. And I'm like, well, maybe, could be happening. On the other hand, the last year or so, it feels different, but it's also, it's been a very enjoyable year for me, and
sure.
Next year might be better, but maybe how much has it changed? I mean, the establishment has invested an enormous amount in discourse about why things are the fault of white men, and therefore to back off from that, especially from angry young white men going, okay, you said this, New York Times, here you said that, Washington Post, we want apologies, we want you to explain why you're wrong. And they're like, oh, we're never going to do that. Yeah. So they may try to memory hole different things. George Floyd's name won't be mentioned as often, but we'll really have to see. But the notion that Donald Trump could get elected, after he lost in 2020, that ought to be a real wake up call, guys. Mm-hmm. That in a lot of ways, like what Will Stansel is saying, the economy, it's not really that bad. So why are people not wanting to vote for Biden? Well, a lot of things is that the general liberal establishment appears to be getting punished for all the hate they've spewed, all the disastrous ideas they've promoted, the transgenderism that the Biden administration is still all in on, just all the craziness of the last 10 years. And people are kind of waking up to the Democratic establishment still kind of believes in all this stuff, and they're downplaying it. So we got to vote for Trump. That hopefully will get a message across. But, there's an awful lot of people in important staff positions in the Democratic Party and NGOs and universities and so forth who don't want, who don't want Joe Biden to have some flashback to 1975 and go, holy cow, this stuff are going crazy. And of course, normal American voters aren't going to vote for it. Let's fight. I got to fire all these people.
Yeah, they're not going to give him that many uppers, I don't think, to make that happen.
Well, I probably have a couple more minutes because I got to get to baseball. But my last question here, before Andrew maybe does one of his, but my last question is: do you feel like you have a more eager audience for your material now than in the '90s, or do you think that your audience was more receptive back then?
I don't know. I mean, there's definitely what I saw last week in New York City was something that I never really anticipated. People have been telling me about for 18 months, but yeah, there's kind of a scene. There's like a downtown Manhattan scene where cool guys and good-looking women go to hang out and talk about dissident conservative ideas like mine. And that was, well, I sure couldn't see that coming. You know, a lot of it's due to, you know, a handful of people like the ladies on the Red Scare podcast, Anna and Dasha, have somehow or other made me cool in my dotage. I'm not counting on that continuing for, you know. I think another generation will come along and go, "What the hell was that about?" But,
No, I don't think so. No, not at all. My last one is just gonna be a fun one. We've covered all the heavy.
Okay, so Steve Saylor said that this was his best interview. I think it was the Armenian, the Filthy Armenian podcast. I think that's my favorite Steve Saylor podcast. But we had the liberal rules-based order that was dominant in American foreign policy after World War II. And now we're seeing a decline because Americans no longer see that in its best interest, right? To hold America accountable to various international institutions was perhaps a useful strategy when we were competing with the Soviet Union for loyalty and alliances around the world. But now regular Americans don't see the benefit to subjugate American best interests to various international institutions. And so Donald Trump embodies an America first policy that seems to me just common sense. Why would every nation not put itself first? Right, here's a discussion between Robert Wright and Kelly Vlahos. She's center.
So if you listen to Tucker, he has fundamental restraint values that he has been espousing way before the Ukraine invasion. And he does reflect this schism on the right over foreign policy. Again, he had Trump's ear at that very moment. I absolutely agree with you, Bob, that Iran is the flashpoint that, you know, gives me a headache when I'm trying to bring this transpartisan thing together, because you not only have this age-old animosity that's baked into the Washington establishment against Iran. I mean, it's a bias that is so fully entrenched. It's worse than the anti-Russia sentiment here. So you have that baked into the establishment. Then you have the neoconservatives and all of the money, the pro-Israel money that is being poured into campaigns all the way up to the presidential campaigns, where they do not see a difference between being pro-Israel and wiping out Iran. And that it is so clear when you look at even Biden's top campaign donors. We had a story on responsible statecraft by Eli Clifton, where he said that at least 1/3 of all of Biden's top campaign donors that have donated to his victory fund, that means everybody that has pledged over $900,000 are rabidly pro-Israel. And within their agendas is you got to get Iran.
And you know, the crazy thing about this is, I mean, maybe I'm just confused, but it seems to me that so many of the things that I consider destructive that are favored by, you know, pro-Israel people, not necessarily in the broad sense of the term, but the kind of, you know, the more hawkishly pro-Israel, I don't even think they're good for Israel. I mean, so many things about Israeli policy that I think are bad are good for politically, maybe for the Israeli leadership. It's great for Bibi Netanyahu to always have this existential enemy that he can scare people about. This is a general thing about leaders, and it's good for the leader of Iran that if his people can worry about Israel, and it's good. It's like the extreme leaders are always playing a non-zero sum game with each other, and they're not necessarily serving their nation's interests. Like, I don't think what Israel's been doing in Gaza is good for Israel in the long run. You know, they're just creating the next generation of people who want to kill Israeli civilians, and you know, because these will be people whose siblings and cousins were killed by Israel. This is the way it works. And it's just frustrating that rapprochement with Iran, I think, would be in the interest of the actual nation of Israel and the nation of the United States. And when, you know, the closest thing that region has come to that, in a way, was orchestrated by China, right? A kind of a rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Right. And I think Biden is trying to undo that, right? His revival of the whole kind of Abraham Accords momentum. And some people think that whole drive from Trump's Abraham Accords to, you know, Biden's following through on it, it led to October, you know, I don't know whether it did or not, lead to the Hamas attack, but there are people who think it didn't. And I think that, to some extent, from Biden's perspective, is a way of countering China. No,
Right.
China wants a stable, peaceful Middle East. No, we can't let China have its way. I mean, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sure you.
No, I agree with what's most upsetting about this is that our foreign policy is being driven by very narrow interests at the top. And those narrow interests, at least if you follow the money, are very anti-Iran and very pro-Israel. And I think if you ask the American people whether or not they want to go to war with Iran, they'll say, "What? Why? No, I guess so because somebody on a radio told me, or a podcast told me, or Fox News has told me," but they don't really know exactly why or how Iran threatens America. I've been, I'm around for a while, and they're still using this trope that Iran is the biggest funder of terrorism in the world. And I don't know where I know where that comes from, and I think that comes from like decades ago. And I'm sure that they're lumping in Hezbollah and Hamas and calling them terrorists, but it seems so shop worn to me. And because there are no
So Hezbollah and Hamas definitely have a terrorist component to what they do, but Hezbollah is part of the Lebanon government, and Hamas runs Gaza, right? It administers the entity of Gaza. So I think a point is that Hezbollah and Hamas aren't solely terrorist organizations.
specific examples of Iran actually invading other countries or bombing other countries. I mean, they have done less than the United States did in the last 20 years in terms of interventions, but they are being raised up as this evil scourge. And there's not much to back it up at this point, but the American people are being told this, but they're being told by very narrow special interests who have major influence over our White House, past and present, Congress, both parties, the establishment in Washington. And that's pretty dangerous because that means we're always on a constant war footing with a country where we can't really explain why.
Mhm. Yeah, I think, of course, Iran definitely funds Hamas and Hezbollah. I think people underestimate the extent to which, I think they overestimate the extent to which that comes out of some like religious ideological imperative, although there's probably some of that, and underestimate the extent to which it's Israel just kind of playing for the hearts and minds of the regional Arab public, right? And B, actual strategy. I mean, Iran, to an extent that people don't understand, feels very insecure. It suffered a devastating war at the hands of Iraq. The U.S. support was on Iraq's side. So, of course, when the U.S. invades Iraq and wants to set up a permanent presence there, you can bet that Iran is going to try to dislodge those troops and get their proxies to kill some of those troops to get them out, and is going to have some proxies because Iraq is a majority Shia nation. And so, Iran is going to be able to cultivate some support. It's just all completely predictable as something that a nation with that history would do. And it's always cast as, Iran is just for reasons we don't understand. They just want to kill everybody.
That's right. It came out of nowhere. It's in a vacuum. Nobody talks about the Iran-Iraq war. They don't talk about how we took a passenger jet out of the sky and killed hundreds of civilians. Oops, it was a mistake. We never apologized for it. Sunk their ships. I mean, this was an active engagement between the U.S. and Iran. This didn't come out of nowhere. And the fact that Hamas and Hezbollah also have civil bodies where they're actually they're running governments. I may not like that. You might not like that, but it's more complicated than just saying that they're funding these terrorist organizations. These terrorist organizations are deeply ingrained in the governments of both Lebanon and Gaza. And to act as though that, like you said, that this was just purely ideological force that needs to be stopped is just is oversimplifying to the greatest extent. And it does such a disservice to the American people because, like I said, they just end up believing whatever they hear and acquiescing when we really should be putting our foot down and saying this is not in our best interest, not in Israel's best interest, and not in Iranians' best interest. But unfortunately, I don't see this getting any better with a new Trump administration at all. And that is going to, like you said, Bob, that's going to be the real sticky wicket there, no matter how.
Okay, good discussion between John Mearsheimer and two blokes from the Duran podcast on the end of the liberal order and the return of war.
Were in the order and that were largely created by the United States applied almost exclusively to the West. The Soviet Union had its own order, it had a bundle of institutions that applied to what we used to call the communist world, right? And this included things like Comecon, Comintern, the Warsaw Pact, and so forth and so on. So you had these two bounded orders that dominated the landscape. Then what happened is the Cold War ended and you moved into unipolarity. And you had only one great power by definition in the system. And this was an opportunity for the United States to take that liberal order that it had created in the West during the Cold War and turn it into a liberal international, and I underline the word international order. And this
right, and the United States developed the liberal order to advance its own best interests vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. Right, there was a time and a place for the United States to invest heavily in alliances. That time and that place is no longer now. Right, with the end of the Cold War, it's time for the United States to act in a more unilateral fashion, as Donald Trump articulates.
Dovetails with NATO expansion, EU expansion. If you think about it, what the United States is doing during the unipolar moment is creating a truly liberal international order. Think about the WTO, which we create during the post-Cold War period, and we bring China into. So we actually do create a liberal international order. But what happens roughly around 2017 is that we begin to morph into a multipolar world. Putin brings Russia back from the dead. China grows to where it's a great power. So you have three great powers in the system. And when you have three great powers in the system, it's going to be hard to sustain a liberal, let me again underline the word international order. Excuse me, especially because the Chinese are going to try to create an order of their own. They're going to.
And more important than it being hard to sustain this liberal order is to question, is this liberal order still in America's best interests? And I would say no, not since the end of the Cold War.
Create their own institutions, and they're going to throw their weight around in the existing institutions to which they're members. But think about the AIIB, think about Belt and Road. There are all sorts of institutions that the Chinese are creating, right, that represent an alternative to the liberal international order, which is beginning to wither away. So at a very broad level, it's important to understand that the rise of China and the resurrection of Russian power is going to undermine that liberal international order that the United States had fostered during the unipolar moment. So that's point number one. Point number two is, although there are powerful structural forces that I just described that are undermining that liberal international order, there's no question that the United States has behaved in ways over the past 10 years that are designed to facilitate the demise of the liberal international order. And you, Glenn, just described some of the policies that we have pursued that have done enormous damage to the liberal international order. And very little of it is left standing as a result. And I think the most graphic evidence of just how much damage we have done is the American reaction to the International Court of Justice's ruling against Israel, and now the International Criminal Court's attempt to give arrest warrants to Israeli leaders. The United States has gone to great lengths to delegitimize these two institutions, which are part of the liberal international order. This makes no sense at all. And of course, these moves by the United States are only representative of a small sample, or only a small sample of the many moves that we've made in recent years to undermine that order. So there is.
So nation states will try to fit into some bigger order than themselves to the extent that's in their self-interest. But when you have a clash between an international order and your national self-interest, all right, all states will be strongly motivated to pursue their national interest and to deviate from the liberal order or whatever the ruling order is that they are part of a coalition.
Is very little left of the liberal international order. And in moving forward, it's not going to be international at all.
The one thing I would say is that, of course, the Cold War, because we have these two very different systems facing off against each other, gave the liberal order in the West, based around the United States, a very great deal of coherence. You could say what it was, and you had the opposite, which is what the Soviets did, which was.
So I don't know if you were alive in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, but there was this widespread sense that we were in a mortal competition with the Soviet Union over which system of government was better, communism or liberal democracy. And we're no longer in that kind of fight, right? The United States does not need to fear or be concerned that other nations might prefer to emulate the governing system of China or Russia, right? Few nations look to China and Russia as models for how they want to conduct themselves. So we no longer have to compete in this ideological struggle, which should make it easier for America just to follow its bare-knuckle national interests, right, without concern for promoting this ideology or going against that ideology, which, it was so silly when Joe Biden made the distinction between autocracy and democracy a centerpiece of his first 2 years. Well, there are going to be plenty of circumstances where it will be in our national interest to align with autocracies. And there will be plenty of circumstances where it will be in our national interest to go against democracies, right? Our own national interests are constantly changing. And I read an essay on Shakespeare that seems quite applicable to this. And so you hear a lot of silly things said about Shakespeare. And Walter Isaacson wrote that best-selling biography of Elon Musk. And Walter Isaacson tries to explain how Elon Musk is attempting simultaneously these epic feats, but he's also a jerk much of the time. And so Walter Isaacson wants to enlist Shakespeare to explain this conundrum. As Shakespeare teaches us, all heroes have flaws, some tragic, some conquered, and those we cast as villains can be complex. So that's how Walter Isaacson tries to fill the gap between epic and asshole, right? With the lesson that Shakespeare was apparently trying to teach us when he wrote Hamlet and King Lear. This is Fintan O'Toole writing in the New York Review of Books. So the only other time that tragic appears in Walter Isaacson's book is when Musk is regretting his choice of outfit for an audience with the Pope. My suit is tragic. So on this level, tragedy is trivial. So our Shakespeare's great play is really trying to teach us something as trite as the possibility that human beings are complex, or that powerful people may have some serious defects, like, who knew? And Walter Isaacson is not unusual in making all these statements about what Shakespeare's tragedies mean, right? They exist to instruct us, guys. And one of their main lessons is that everything would be okay if we could only conquer our shortcomings, if we could only develop our moral character. So we had a review in The Guardian of the Harry Potter novels. Quote, some of the most admirable adult characters, as in Shakespeare, are also revealed to have a tragic flaw that causes them to hesitate to act, to make foolish errors of judgment, to lie, or even to commit murder. And the New York Times tells us that with Shakespeare's Hamlet or Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, their tragic flaws enacted become the definition of tragedy. And then the former British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, supposedly been working for many years writing a book on Shakespeare, has compared himself to Othello, beset by the malign Iago, claims that it is the essence of all tragic literature that the hero should be conspicuous and that he should swagger around, and some fatal flaw should lead to a catastrophic reversal. And also in the New York Times, we've got Stephen Marsh telling us that we go to tragedy to watch a man be destroyed. Macbeth must be destroyed because of his lust for power, Othello for his jealousy, Antony for his passion, Lear for the incompleteness of his renunciation. They are tragic precisely because their flaws are all too human. And then we have a biography of Andrew Jackson where the president is called a Shakespearean tragic hero, inflexible as Coriolanus, whose tragic flaw was his incessant pursuit of virtue in the political realm. And Maureen Dowd notes that Barack Obama has read and reread Shakespeare's tragedies and does not want his fatal flaw to be that he compromises so much that his ideals get blurred out of recognition. So everything I just read about Shakespeare is fatuous, delusional, shallow, right? It's just the stuff of cliches. And what's underlying it is this theory of life, right? This theory of mind that your own problems and disasters are primarily of your own making. Well, sometimes they are, but frequently that they are not, because we all exist in a society, and what's going on around us, despite the best of our efforts, will have a profound effect on us, all right? We get tragedies not just because of our own flaws, right, but because we're all dragged between large historical, social, and political forces that are pushing and pulling us in many different directions. And so too with the international liberal order, right? That was a force at one time, useful force, going up against the Soviet Union, but in a different circumstance with the end of the Cold War, it ceased to be in America's best interests. So all these insights that I just listed into Shakespeare are dull and shallow and bogus, right? morality tales in which people do bad things because they are bad, and then they get their comeuppance, right? These are the fact of cliche. And none of this bears slightest resemblance to what we are seeing in Shakespeare, right? In Shakespeare, we encounter dramas that are not about, comeuppance and rewarded virtue, right? Shakespeare is not providing us with many answers, right? There's nothing in Cordelia or Ophelia or Desdemona or Amelia's characters that leads them to extinction, right? It's simply that in this cruel world, right, the bad may end unhappily, but so may the good, right? You can try to be a righteous person, but that does not protect you from the common cold or getting the flu or dying from a heart attack or cancer. Right. If you read Shakespeare, you come out thinking after Hamlet, well, if only Hamlet had been less angsty, nothing would have been rotten in the state of Denmark. Like if only Israel had done X, then Israel would be saved. Like if only Macbeth wasn't so consumed with lust for power, he would have been fine. If only Othello didn't have such jealousy, he would have been okay. But we're all acting within a constantly changing situation. And the strategies that work in one situation are not going to work in a different situation. Right? So Shakespeare's tragedy are not a moral instruction. They're not a classroom. Right? Against the foreground of his action is the background of death, which stalks us all. And we're all constantly being pushed outward by the centrifugal force of the actions around us. And then we're also held in place by centripetal forces, right? So we're all sucked into dizzying spins of circumstance. And our moral instincts often go against our pragmatic interests. Right? Wouldn't it be nice if our pragmatic interests just always aligned with the most lofty of moral ideals? But that's not what's going on. And some of the most compelling characters in Shakespeare are people doing monstrous things. So Hamlet is entertaining, he's brilliant, he's sensitive, he's charismatic, he's eloquent, right? And he's also astonishingly cruel. He kills one person by mistake, Polonius. He tortures his sister. He dispatches Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. And he does a lot of horrible things because people tend, to the extent that they have moral strengths, right, they tend to be moral strengths in one domain, right? The person who is honest with his taxes is no more likely to be honest in his marriage, right? Someone who's nice to his neighbor, not necessarily going to be ethical in business. And so as situations constantly change and challenge us, right, we're constantly trying to adapt to bewildering circumstances. And sometimes our circumstances are simply going to get the best of us. Right? Sometimes the best thing we can do is leave. Right? So Shakespeare is not primarily about moral instruction. Right? He's probably more about moral destruction, creating the form and pressure of the times through a great unraveling in which the known becomes the unknown. Right? Circumstances can change so that everything we think we know about the situation we're in, we would be better off if we unknew it. Right? Sometimes times are cruel, and cruel times call for different strategies and different aspects of our character than good times. Right? Where do you have the jumpy guards on the battlements of Elsinore as Hamlet begins? Right? It's not so much watching out for ghosts, but they know that war is coming. Before Macbeth even meets the witches, Scotland is beset by civil war and invasion. As the action of Othello begins, right, we're getting messages arriving in Venice with the news of the coming Turkish assault on Cyprus. War has already begun. Right, the only one of the four protagonists in Shakespeare's four great tragedies who can be said to unleash large-scale violence by his own actions is King Lear. But even then, the speed with which his kingdom falls apart after his abdication makes us wonder whether it would not have descended into chaos anyway if he had merely died of old age. So we don't encounter soothing, easy comforts in Shakespeare. We don't learn that, oh, imperfect men cause trouble, and then they are justly punished. But Hamlet and Macbeth, Othello and King Lear are distinguished in their dramas by the illusion that they can determine events by their own actions. They believe they have the power to say what will happen next, but no amount of power can ever be great enough in an irrational world where we can dictate what happens next. Right? The universe does not follow our orders. Right? That is tragic. Right? It's nice to imagine a time when these Shakespearean plays could be loved for their poetry alone, but there is not yet a world that does not know the violence of these plays or the fury with which reality responds to all attempts to force it to obey one man's will. Right? There is no place in history where "be not found here" is not good advice for millions of vulnerable people. Right? We return to Shakespeare's tragedies because the wilder the terror Shakespeare unleashes, the deeper is the pity and the greater the wonder that even in this howling tempest, we can still hear the voices of broken individuals so amazingly articulated. They do not, when they speak, reduce the fright. They allow us rather in those bewildering moments to try to be equal to it.
Different, and you could compare the two, and you could say this is the liberal order and this is the communist order, and there are these differences. There is this clear divide. When the communist system went, and there's an attempt to make the liberal order universal, and I want to say this. I mean, both of you probably remember this better than me, but one of the things I remember about the Cold War, at least, was, that the idea was that if communism is defeated, or if the communists defeat us, then whichever of the two systems prevailed, that would become the universal system. I mean, it was couched to a certain degree in those terms. So it's not surprising that there was an attempt to make it universal. The moment it became universal, it lost coherence, because there isn't any longer that level of comparison, that the sense that there is the alternative that you must not become too identical to, and it's, I think, inevitable. So I think it's inevitable that there was this attempt to spread it around the world, and it was inevitable that merely by that act it began to develop contradictions within itself. And of course, over time, those contradictions grew because they became connected very much to the belief that in order to preserve this new liberal order, you needed at the core American power, because without it, it would regress. And of course, over time, the importance of focusing on power created more complications and more contradictions as well, because the exercise of power, almost by definition, requires some degree of transgression of whatever rules there are. So I think this was a process that, in effect, was programmed to happen from the moment the Cold War ended. And of course, as the relative power of the United States has declined, as we've gone from a unipolar situation to a multipolar one, which was inevitable, it's become impossible to conceal those contradictions anymore. I mean, that's what I wanted to say.
I would just jump in, Alexander, and say I agree with you, of course, but I think the United States could have done a much better job managing the liberal international order if it had had a lighter touch. There's this distinction in the international relations discourse between hard power and soft power. And I think the United States used to be quite good when it came to soft power. We certainly were during the Cold War. But I think during the unipolar moment, as it wore on, we got less and less capable of exercising soft power. And we became sort of a blunderpuss, or we acted like a blunderpuss in our relations with lots of countries around the world. And we alienated them. And we did a lot, I think, to undermine the liberal international order. I think if we had been more sophisticated, we had a lighter touch, we would have been able to preserve it for a longer period of time. And during that period, we would have gotten more out of the order than we're now getting.
I think that's unequivocally true. I'm not going to dispute that, because I think the record speaks for itself. I mean, I think that at some point, the United States lost its ability to conduct negotiations and diplomacy and understand others, and it became impatient and aggressive in ways that it absolutely did not need to be, losing sight of it ultimately of what was its own ultimate best interests. But there we are.
I would just to jump in quickly, Glenn, I would emphasize here that a lot of this has to do with the fact that the United States is a crusader state. And it's a crusader state because it's a liberal state. The United States is committed to remaking the world, or has long been committed to remaking the world in its own image, and using military force if necessary to achieve that end. And the result is that we have gone around the world and behaved in a very heavy-handed way because of this liberal ideology. It's kind of counterintuitive, because liberals are usually portrayed as being against the use of military force. And it's realists like me who are described as hard-nosed proponents of using force here, there, and everywhere. But in a very important way, the exact opposite is the difference. Realists tend to have less interest in using military force than liberals do. Again, it's because of this crusader impulse that is hardwired into liberal ideology.
So almost all liberal international relations theorists are left of center, right? You might be very tempted to think, oh, they're realists, therefore they're going to be right of center, but almost all of them are on the left. John Mearsheimer would have voted for Bernie Sanders if he'd had that opportunity. So in a tragic world, it's very tempting to want to escape the world. And one of the primary methods of escape that people have used to find comfort is religion. And there's a new memoir out, Cloistered: My Years as a Nun, by Catherine Coldstream. And it's reviewed here in the New York Review of Books. And so anyone who has even a passing encounter with the nun content produced over the NUN, produced over the past century, understands what's coming in a nun memoir. This will be a story of religious corruption and tyrannical subjugation. There will be theological psyops, the twisting of scripture to serve human power structures, furtive sapphic exploits, and women acting as accomplices to the dictates of patriarchy. So often people want to escape from the confusing and imperfect world around them, the dirty world around them, into religion. And then in the world of religion, they find all the same flaws. So all religious autobiography hinges on a drama of escape, right? Escape from reality, right? So the convert speaks from a vantage of liberation. They have been freed from the shackles of sin, from the shackles of meaninglessness, and they look back on their years that you lived in bondage as a prisoner of your own impulses. And then you get the deconversion narrative that relies on the same arc, but in reverse. The apostate wins their freedom by fleeing the prison of institutional religion. Now, each narrative is, of course, a lie. The believer, even after he's glimpsed eternity, must continue to live in the world with other fallen human beings in his own wayward flesh. And anyone who has left the church finds inevitably that secular life has plenty of constraints and disappointments of its own. So what drives the religious narrative impulse is that first ecstatic taste of freedom, this imagination that you have been saved, right? You've been either saved from religion or you've been saved by religion, and there is no salvation, right? No one is coming to save you. There's no one dramatic act that you as an individual or you as a people or you as a nation state can do to save yourself. So the author of this memoir was raised in North London by two successful artists. Her father was a British painter, William Coldstream. And when her father died in her mid-20s, right, the trauma hit with a seismic force, right? There tends to be a special relationship between fathers and daughters, like there often is between mothers and sons. And so even though Coldstream had not been raised religious, right, she became convinced in her grief that she had a father in heaven. And so she began searching for a community to sustain her new faith in immortality. She read C.S. Lewis and Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard and the Bible. She worked at a soup kitchen. She met a Dominican nun. She spent hours in solitary prayer, and she decided to give her life over to God. So I know people who spend hours and hours in prayer, and they don't live up to their obligations as men or women, to their spouses, to their families, to their employers, right? I find that the more God intoxicated the person, the less likely he is to be useful to other people. And the more useful people tend to be the least God intoxicated. Conversion experiences are usually the least convincing part of a faith narrative, right? The conversion epiphanies, right? These watermarks of shifting internal states consist of pure, untested potentiality. Now I'm free. And this particular author here, Coldstream, her passages about her conversion are fittingly vague to the point of meaninglessness. So at age 27, she enters a pseudonymous Carmelite order where she spends the next 12 years, and shock upon shock, she finds within this order the same sort of problems that she experienced in the wider world. Right? She'd come to this order to punish her flesh, to pray in solitude, only to discover that the nuns care more about maintaining a robust social life and relaxing after a day of singing and prayer. She's outraged by the sheer excess and lack of balance when it comes to pleasure and fun. So many converts are outraged by the lack of religious rigor on the part of their newfound religious community. And in this memoir, she lists off all the rules that the leader of the convent is breaking. She calls off chores on a whim. She allows nuns to phone their families during the Great Silence. And she secretly feeds feral cats that are not supposed to be let inside. And her outrage peaks when she hears the Mother Superior telling another novice that she need not bother reading St. John of the Cross. Wasn't he one of the foundational teachers of the order? So she is disappointed that none of the sisters want to discuss the theology. And the author dreads the mandated recreation. She finds the monastery life insufficiently radical. Now, any bookish person can sympathize with the tyranny of leisure. So you give me a certain social interaction or mandated leisure, and I yearn to return to my books. And few things are more disappointing to the typical convert than religious laxity. Right? So she joined this convent hoping to find a gathering of the like-minded, but instead she found a motley crew. And they were also from a much lower class than herself, right? She was one of the few nuns who came from an upper-class family, and so she had trouble fitting in. And she finds that she's disliked for artistic temperament, right? She's chided for how easily she cries, and when she plays the viola and loses herself in ecstatic rapture. So the convent wasn't sufficiently sensitive to her artistic yearnings. Only certain people were allowed to be themselves, she complained. Only certain characteristics counted as human enough for the Mother Superior. Being sensitive, introspective, artistic, emotional, creative, questioning, or philosophically inclined just didn't count. So art and religion are two ways that people try to find meaning in life. And what type of people go searching for meaning in life? People who lack normal human ties, right? This woman was not normally engaged with other people. She had not built a family of her own. And so into that void, she tries to fill it with religion and art. And she's looking to create a life of artistic genius, but very few people have artistic genius capabilities. Right? She's trying to be a lover of Bach. Right? She wants her whole life to be, as magnificent and perfect as the music of Bach. Instead, she's forced to sing Denny Boy and dance the hokey cokey. So she's excluded from the other nuns, right? She feels singled out and punished. She considers herself not merely an artist, but a rebel and a philosopher and a prophet. And she says that religious people either tend to be club-minded or heavily minded. Right? So the prophets, the mouthpieces for God, are those concerned with the big picture and speaking out, uttering the truth, having the courage of their convictions, speaking truth to power. Right? That's one type of religious person, but most religious people are club-minded, right? They will only say that which is approved by the group of which they're a part. And if you want to survive and thrive with your community, then you will speak primarily only that which is approved by the human collective of which you are a part, right? There's going to be a severe cap on how far you can go in saying many things, right? There's no community that does not deny much of reality. And so she feels bullied and snubbed, and you kind of yearn for the author to embrace her prophetic megalomania and disappear into the desert, climb to the top of some mountain, call on a complacent church to find its way back to its pioneering ideals. But she rarely voices her grievances aloud. Now, she was not alone in her idealistic fervor, right? She managed to find one other nun who was just as excited, but this nun has a mental breakdown. So many of the people who are the most fervent, right, are also the most mentally ill, because if you are mentally stable, right, you're connected to other people and you're at ease with yourself, and you're going to have less need to go take these dramatic religious journeys, right? The desire to embrace self-immolation, right, does not come from a healthy, happy, constructive place. Right? Someone who's obsessed with conquering temptation and suppressing one's true feelings is not usually a happy, well-adjusted person. And she ends up concluding that her problems are the fault of the convent. And so she ends up leaving the convent, getting married, and moving on. Right. So when she's able to establish a home of her own with the man that she loves, all right, she doesn't have the same extreme need for searching for meaning and for transcendent purpose. So we will often go make dramatic gestures to avoid confronting the darkness in our own soul. And she notes, I joined the convent blinded by my love affair with the divine. So there are many ways that we can get intoxicated by religion or alcohol or sports or Netflix, anything to avoid confronting the lack of ease that we have with ourselves.
Well, it's interesting you refer to crusader state, because I was wondering if there's a contradiction then in the idea of liberal hegemony, because liberalism kind of carries with it these two legacies on one hand, or definitions, an internal contradiction, because on one hand liberalism should be based on tolerance towards different views, so different regime types as well, the ability to harmonize and get along. And on the other side, you have liberalism, which is often also based on these universal ideals and values. So there's the assumption that everyone will begin to conform around these same values. And when that doesn't happen, there's a less and less acceptance, if you will, towards different regime types. And the reason why I'm thinking it's perhaps inconsistent with hegemony is because if you do have a hegemony, you have a dominance, you have the tools to force through this universalism. And so that aspect of liberalism, and kind of ignore the aspect where there's supposed to be tolerance to different regime types in order to get along. And I remember your colleague, Stephen Walt, I think he made this point that after the Cold War, the main challenge for the United States, I think he compared it to a 500-pound gorilla or something, that the main problem was how to restrain itself, because others couldn't restrain the US anymore. And now it had to find a way of restraining itself. And well, states do not constrain themselves. So this is a key problem. So I think this is why you might see the United States engage in excessive use of force and perhaps undermine a lot of the same liberal ideals in the same process.
I mean, I agree with you completely. There is that tension sitting at the heart of liberalism. And I think what happened is that the lack of tolerance that is embedded in liberalism triumphed over the tolerance that is also embedded in liberalism. And we got ourselves into a lot of trouble. And by the way, it's not just the United States, it's the West more generally, because most European countries drank the Kool-Aid. And if you sort of look at what we're doing around the world.
And Laponia says in the chat, how many Bachi boys would each male get under a secular Quranic regime? I just renewed my subscription to the New York Review of Books. I just love this publication. And there's an excellent review here about a new book from Peter Heather. It's called Christendom, The Triumph of a Religion, AD 300 to 1300. So it's a colossal book written by a colossus in the field, The Triumph of a Religion. It covers a millennium from the conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine in the year 312 to the baptism of the Grand Duke of Lithuania, the last pagan ruler of Europe, around 1250. So why was Christianity so successful? And the author rejects the romantic notion that Christianity rose to the top of the late Roman Empire by its intrinsic merits alone without the help of the powerful. And the author has the attitude that essentially Constantine's revolution by converting to Christianity in year 312 was perhaps the most audacious act ever committed by an autocrat in disregard and defiance of the vast majority of his subjects. So sometimes a powerful leader can do things against the will of the overwhelming majority of his subjects. And this new book offers a cogent analysis of the structure of Roman upper-class society and its relationship to the Roman state, which made Roman elites particularly vulnerable to pressure from a Christian court. So my understanding of why Christianity rose to power was, one, it was in part a top-down phenomenon. The ruling elites found benefit with allying with Christianity and creating an in-group around Christianity. Two, many individuals found meaning and purpose and a way of life that was simply superior to what they had elsewhere. And those are the two primary reasons, right? It helped individuals and communities, and it was also of use to ruling elites. So ruling elites from Constantine on, right, pushed people into joining their in-group, but it wasn't always done at the point of a sword, right? There wasn't a late Roman state that could enforce an ideology, but it could seduce, right? So the Roman elite had networks of friends and clients that stretched from the court to the lower reaches of the gentry, and there was this never-ceasing waterfall of favors asked and favors received. If you wanted to get anything done, you had to please someone, and this someone was someone who would please the emperor and those around him. Once the emperor made plain that he was an Orthodox Christian and that he would shut his ears to the petitions of non-Christians, the message trickled down in society with surprising speed, and you had the development of a confessional Christian state. And by 379, access to public offices and the full privileges of Roman citizenship were restricted solely to co-religionists, right? Something like a Communist Party membership in a communist country. And so the Christianization of the Roman world very much occurred from the top down. Now, not every Christian was entitled to this membership. There are all sorts of Christians who had complicated attitudes and belief systems and practices that were considered, out of bounds. So this Christianity from 300 AD to 1300 AD, it was varied, right? But throughout this millennium, it was the rulers, first the emperors and then the local rulers, who largely called the shots. So from Western Europe, from the Atlantic coast of Ireland in the 6th and 7th century to Iceland in the 10th, you had a well-tried formula. You had the combination of the carrot and the stick, right? And that was usually sufficient to create Christian communities, which were then served by local bishops and clergies, who in turn served the ruling king or secular leader, because they were the ones who had literacy. So you didn't have a central ecclesiastical authority, right? A powerful papacy only developed in the 13th century. And every generation brought its own style of Christianity. Christianity had to constantly adapt to changing circumstances. So you had different notions, different practices, constantly coming to the fore because of the changing circumstances in society. So there was not a single juggernaut Christianity proceeding all the way from the Galilee to the shores of the Baltic. All right, we have a series of Christianities, each distinctive and different. If you imagine Christians of one age, you'd be dumbfounded by the Christians of a different age. And so if you read this new book, you experience the whoosh of a roller coaster as Christianity passes from one form to another against the background of an ever wider Europe. And the book ends with the Lateran Council of 1215, at which Christianity is transformed once again to become the Catholic Church that we can now recognize. It's the Church of the Crusades in the great cathedrals of Gothic Europe. It's a church centered firmly on the papacy. It starts legislating every detail of the Christian life, creating a uniform Christianity. Its representatives and decrees reach the farthest corners of Europe, and it's a church that flexes its muscles by turning the state against heretics and Jews, the development of the Inquisition, right? The product not of mindless bigots, but products of the finest minds in the newly founded universities. So we have, before that, 1,000 years of a rich, descented creativity in which the population of Europe moves from a position of enormous religious diversity to Lateran uniformity. And what is the author trying to convey to us? And this New York Review of Books states he must imagine many of his readers to be what the English call blokes, just average Joes with their heads screwed on with little time for metaphysical matters. They relate easily to the scenarios in which Roman mandarins and pagan warlords slip into Christianity as a result of a little nudge from on high. And so this is a study of governing class interests more than stormy accounts of individual confessions. But there were many stormy accounts of individual confessions. So which individuals had these stormy confessions? Usually ones who are not married with kids, right? If your life was working, you're much less vulnerable to having these stormy confessions and dramatic religious conversions. So the reviewer objects to this model of Christianity because it makes average believers seem more passive than they really were. The author writes of the progress of the Christian church as if he were a CEO, viewing with contentment the smooth functioning of his enterprise. And the reviewer says that we need to hear more about the Holy Ghost, right? So all sorts of individuals were driven by demons and their experiences of the divine and the malevolent. They were touched by the warm presence of benevolent spirits, right? Their souls were moved because, right, individuals also respond to incentives. If their life isn't working, right, if reality is too boring or too oppressive, then people will have tremendous incentive to escape to a new type of living, one where they have this ecstatic communion with the divine.
World. When I use the term we, there's no question the United States is in the vanguard, but the European powers are right up there with them, especially the British.
Oh yeah, no, I wouldn't suggest this is exclusive to the United States. I think, as you mentioned, when the West is liberals often become more aggressive. I think this also applies to the Europeans, simply because if you have an ideology which suggests that the contemporary flawed world of security competition can be transcended towards some perpetual peace, if we just all adopt these universal values, it tends to legitimize very violent means. So who wouldn't want to go on perpetual war if it brings with it the promise of perpetual peace? So I think this is something we bought into as well, very much, even more so in the hubris after the Cold War, in which we had this special mandate to transform the world to a better place. And once politicians believe they have this power, I think they're really willing to devote significant resources and use some very ugly means to achieve it.
It's very interesting to know when exactly the United States did become a crusader state, because at some level, I mean, there's always been, at least in British liberalism, there's always been a tension between an imperialist liberalism, people like Mill, for example, and an anti-imperialist liberalism, which has also existed. And Hobson, who wrote this book, he's the famous book, Criticizing Empire, for example, was an anti-imperialist liberal. When did the United States decide to become an imperial, rather not imperial, a crusader state that saw its mission to expand liberalism all over the world? Was this always so? Was it there? It's hardwired from the beginning, or did it develop perhaps around with Wilson and the period around the First World War, or did it come after, during the Second World War? Because I should say that amongst many people in Europe, and by the way, I agree completely that the Europeans today are as aggressive in promoting liberalism as the Americans are. But at one time in Europe, there was this belief that the United States was different, that it was not a crusader in the same way. My father, who was very, very much part of the old European political left, for example, was born in the 1920s. His conception of the United States was that it was liberal, which is, of course, a good thing to be as far as he was concerned, but that it was also pacific, that it didn't have great armies, didn't interfere around the world, that it looked to itself, developed its economy, and even after the Second World War, he always retained a sort of lingering belief that this was so, and that the period of the Cold War was a kind of anomaly.
Let me say a couple words, Alexander, to try and answer your question. But
so sometimes I'll spend most of my day just reading books, and occasionally I will feel lonely. Rarely does that sense of loneliness afflict me, but it occasionally impinges into my consciousness. But probably just as frequently, if not more frequently, I'll be socializing, and after a couple of hours, it will drive me crazy. I am just dying to get back to my books. I just can't wait to leave mundane, earthly, worldly conversations behind and just return to my books. And there's a great review here in the New York Review of Books titled Livelier Than the Living. And it's a review of two books, one called A Marvelous Solitude, The Art of Reading in Early Modern Europe, and the other book is called Untold Futures, Time and Literary Culture in Renaissance England. So in the Renaissance, reading became both a passion and a pose of detachment for those who could afford it from the pursuits of wealth and power. So if you're losing in the pursuit of wealth and power, it can be quite comforting to comfort yourself with reading a lot. And I guess there's no way about it. I have consistently been losing at the pursuit of wealth and power. And to comfort myself, I have devoted a great deal of time to reading. I remember when I first moved to the United States, I think in May of 1977, I would spend all my days in the Pacific Union College library and started off reading books on World War II, then reading books on Weimar Germany because they had some pretty racy photos. I was 11 years of age at this time, and I would read 8 hours a day because I didn't know anyone in this new setting. And when I did meet my future classmates, because I had ADHD, because I was a bit socially maladjusted, I would greet them by splashing water at them and, trying to instigate arguments. I was always trying to set up debates in my school. And the teachers were worried that I was not reading books appropriate for my age. And so they tried to get me to stop reading books at the college library and instead, read the much simpler books in my elementary school. And so for me, over the course of my life, reading has been both an inspiration. It's been the number one thing that I wanted to do, but it has also been a solace and a comfort and perhaps a pose of detachment from losing at so much of life, right? I've never married. I don't have kids. I'm not rich, and I've never been rich. I've never been powerful, never been married, and never been a father. And so to comfort myself from losing at the game of life, I have spent a great deal of my time reading books. And a lot of people I notice who are losing at the game of life seek comfort. Some of them by participating in online gaming, others playing a lot of video games, other people by creating live streams, other people by following sports intensely, or by watching Netflix, or doing drugs or alcohol, or pursuing sex. All right, there are many ways that someone can seek comfort. But these two new books are about the pursuit of comfort through the art of reading in early modern Europe. And it begins by quoting the Italian poet Petrarch in 1348. Right? And he says, "I daily listen to your words with more attention than one would believe. Perhaps I shall not be thought impertinent in wishing to be heard by you." And who was Petrarch talking to? Petrarch was talking to the Roman philosopher Seneca, who died about 1300 years previous. So Petrarch had a practice of writing to long-dead authors. Reminds me a bit of my virtual relationship with the talk show host Dennis Prager, right? I passionately, faithfully listen to his shows and write him letters. So there was this movement in the 14th and 15th century, a humanist imitatio. It is an exchange by which schoolboys and scholars across late medieval and early modern Europe formed their ideas, their values, their images, their tastes, and their turns of phrase along the lines of an antiquity that they were just beginning to regard as classical. And so this was both a pedagogic method and a critical background. Who would you take on as your exemplar? So if we were to have like a passionate discussion, all right, I would in all likelihood bring to you what I thought were my best qualities in moral judgment and in information. And so when you reveal who your favorite pundit is, all right, or your favorite intellectuals, all right, you're revealing who you are and who you choose to follow. All right, it says a great deal about you. All right, which particular texts appeal to you. All right, that says something about both your genetics and your early upbringing and the incentives around you. So who do you want to take on as your exemplar? Who do you want to closely follow? Like, which intellectual models do you want to embrace? Which intellectual models do you want to avoid? Which intellectual models do you want to improve on? These are all subjects of fervent debate among the literati in the 14th, 15th, and 16th century. So in theory, you would emulate the best, and that would lead you to a higher realm. But in practice, emulation frequently leads to intellectual sterility. So the primary rewards of this type of imitation were emotional, right? You got to commune with other minds, and this fortified you against your disappointments in the present, right? I've never been married, never been rich, never been powerful, never been successful, but I've fortified myself by reading a lot and living in this imaginary virtual world of ideas. So when you spend time with your favorite books, you can gather your dearest and closest imaginary friends, all right? Even people who've died hundreds and thousands of years before you. And if you're failing at real life, this may be an enormous sense of comfort. right? So for people who struggle accumulating wealth and power and don't have particularly close ties with the people around them, right, reading will bring pleasures more intimate and more intense than the satisfactions afforded by other worldly goods. But this intimacy, this removal of oneself from life, always comes at a cost, all right? You'll have a sense of being unsuited to your time and situation. You'll have a feeling of being extraneous, useless, and alienated from those around you. So it's very likely to develop upon misanthropic tendencies. And so those of us who love to lose ourselves in books, all right, we just find them more satisfying than talking to people. And I indeed usually find reading a book more satisfying than talking to 98% of people that I could talk with. Right? Because when you absorb yourself in a book, there's no tedium, right? You have no complaints, you have no envy, there's no deceit and murmur, right? You are satisfied with very meager physical possessions. You are satisfied with a lack of power and prestige in the real world. You don't need expensive food or drink. You are released from your sexual obsessions and other jealousies, right? Instead, you can find your ideal companions in these books. And so if you think that your real world friends just don't measure up, you might think, oh, this one's too apathetic, this one's too anxious, this one's too slow, this one's too hasty, this one's too sad, this one's too cheerful, this one's too simple, another one's too wise than I want. I fear this one's taciturnity, I fear this one's loquacity. And so who do you bring with you, right? You may well bring with you the authors of your favorite books. So Petrarch brought his youngest brother, Gerardo, and a pocket-sized copy of Augustine's Confessions when he climbed a mountain, right? Mount Ventoux. And arriving at the summit, exhausted and out of breath, he opened the volume of Augustine's Confessions at random, and he read this from Book 10. Men go about to wonder at the heights of the mountains and the mighty waves of the sea and the wide sweep of the rivers and the circuit of the ocean and the revolution of the stars, but themselves they consider not. And Petrarch took this as a rebuke and as a revelation. I was satisfied that I'd seen enough of the mountain. I now turned my inward eye upon myself. And one may indeed feel that the author's words are addressed to me and to no other. So Petrarch developed this myth of reading as a dialogue with the dead, right? Something that's both timeless and immediate. And so he wrote to a friend, I've read what is said in Virgil, Horace, Boethius, and Cicero, not once, but countless times. I've thoroughly absorbed these writings. I've implanted them not only in my memory, but in the very marrow of my bones. They have become one with my mind, that were I never to read them again for the rest of my life, they would cling to me. They have taken root in the innermost recesses of my mind. So we are born to connect. And if we don't connect with other people, as is the norm and as usually the healthiest solution, we'll have to bond with something else. And probably better to bond with books than to bond with drugs or alcohol or promiscuous sex. And Petrarch told a friend, did not our forefathers, whom we wish to emulate, spend all their lives with books, with literature, and grow old with literature, and meet their end with literature? And Petrarch would keep emphasizing the advantages of books over living people, right? Those who think they are alive because they see traces of their stale breath in the frosty air, right? So no doubt people like Virgil and Horace and Boethius and Cicero had their own human failings, right? They may have been difficult and stubborn. They might have had halitosis, but in their writings, the flower and the fruit of their intellect is undiluted and abounding. You get to live in an abstracted, somewhat idealized world. Right, so the ghost that one encounters through reading is better than the real person in this perspective, right? The book is the mirror of the soul, but it is a mirror that selects the best. It refines the image of the author. It cleanses it of all traces of the mundane. And so for the person who yearns for refinement, they may well find the ultimate escape from the banality of the present in books. So Petrarch confessed to a friend, I have dwelt single-mindedly on learning about antiquity, because this present age always displeases me. My father would often say, I don't give a cracker for this world. I always wish to have been born in any other age and to forget this age. I want to graft myself into the minds of the ages. I am grateful to all those authors I have read, and I do hope that those who read me will be similarly grateful. All right, so reading becomes a passion if you lack passions in real life, then and now. It's also a pose, right? It can demonstrate an aristocratic detachment from the pursuit of wealth and power and social connections. And for many people, their library is their crowning glory. And many, set aside a room, a particular, a holy place for reading, just as you may very well set aside a special room in your home to enjoy this show. And when you go into this holy room, you may well light a candle. You may dress in special clothing to befit the mastery and the majesty of this show.
Before I do that, just to reinforce your point regarding your father, you want to remember that Roosevelt was deeply committed to putting an end to the British Empire and the European empires more generally. Americans did not like the whole concept of empire at all. And that's when we had a more restrained liberal view of international politics. Now, with regard to your question, I think there are two events that are of enormous importance for explaining when we turned into a crusader state. First is the end of the Cold War. Just think about the Frank Fukuyama argument. The Fukuyama argument, which was widely accepted in the United States, and I believe the West more generally, is that the Cold War had been an ideological conflict between communism and liberal democracy, and liberal democracy had won. And Frank made the argument in the famous piece that we had defeated fascism in the first half of the 20th century, and then we had defeated communism in the second half of the 20th century. And we had triumphed in a way that was almost unimaginable before the Cold War ended. So we were so full of ourselves when that Cold War ended, right? We just thought that, liberalism was the future. And this is what Fukuyama says. As time goes by, eventually all the countries on the planet are going to turn into liberal democracies because it's a wonderful thing. Once that happens, you're really off to the races, right? Now, throughout the 1990s, the Clinton administration was very hesitant about using military force to support that crusader impulse, and largely because of Vietnam. But then the Afghanistan war happens. And I think what happens in the first few months of that war is enormously important for explaining why we turned to using military force to support the crusader impulse. You remember, we get attacked on September 11th, and then we go to war in mid-October of 2001. And the war is effectively over by early December of 2001. It really goes for 2 months at the most. And it looks like we have won a spectacular victory. The Taliban has been decisively defeated, we believe. The Europeans come in to help run Afghanistan. And we adopt the Bush doctrine at that point because we think we have now found the magic formula for knocking off regimes, putting in a democratic leader, and then moving on to the next target. So after we're done with Afghanistan, we think we can do Iraq. We think Iraq will be quick and easy. Didn't Afghanistan tell us that? We knocked off the Taliban in 2 months. We put Karzai in power. Now we're off to deal with Iraq. I remember when the Israelis caught wind that we were going to do Iraq before we did Iran. This is right around January 2003, if my memory is correct. The Israelis sent a delegation over to talk to the Bush administration to ask why they were doing Iraq and not doing Iran. And the Bush administration and the neoconservatives more generally told the Israelis, relax, we're going to do Iraq. And when we're done with Iraq, we'll do Iran or Syria. And pretty soon all the countries in the region are going to throw up their hands because they're going to understand that we have the magic formula for knocking off regimes and replacing them with liberal democracy. So just don't worry, we'll get to Iran in due course.
So you'll often find in the narratives of people who are all passionate about their great search for meaning, their love for books, you'll often detect a false note or two. You'll kind of sense the strain in their narratives. You'll recognize that their great search for meaning, right, that they try to convince you is something angelic, something astounding, something meritorious, is in large part a distraction or a comfort from failures in real life, right? So we often get a sense of how our own self-flattering mythology is a compensation or a failure to compensate for our inability to find other sources of purpose and fulfillment aside from our one designated source of purpose and fulfillment in religion or in intellectual endeavors or in following our favorite sports teams or in politics or with other people too. You'll often start hearing these false notes. You'll detect the strain that they're trying to convince themselves how meritorious their pursuit of meaning or religious purpose is. So people who have children usually don't need to seek excitement elsewhere, don't need to go searching for meaning. But if you're failing in the real world and you don't have children and you don't see yourself having prospects of attaining money or power, then you've got to find comfort somewhere. So Machiavelli, in the 16th century, in 1512, he was removed from office, he was arrested, he was tortured, and finally released to a farm. And in a letter to a patron, he talked about his nightly communion with books that helped him to endure the failures of real life, that helped him to endure the privations and the tedium of exile. He says, "On the coming of evening, I return to my house and enter my study. And at the door, I take off the day's clothing covered with mud and dust and put on garments regal and courtly. And reclothed appropriately, I enter the ancient courts of ancient men, where, received by them with affection, I feed on that food which only is mine and which I was born for, where I am not ashamed to speak with them and to ask them the reasons for their actions. And they, in their kindness, answer me. And for 4 hours of time, I do not feel boredom. I forget every trouble. I do not dread poverty. I'm not frightened by death. Entirely, I give myself over to them." And because Dante says it is no true knowledge unless we remember what we have understood, I've noted everything in their conversations which has benefited me, and I've composed a little work, The Prince. So this is the most extraordinary rendering of the benefits of reading. But the pleasures of Niccolò Machiavelli's reading are both a backdrop, a carefully arranged backdrop to the scene of his writing, which he is using to try to regain a place in the world, right? He needs his patron's help, right? He's running out of money. So at the end of this very same letter, he mentions, "I'm using up my money. I'm entering poverty. I wish that the people in power will make use of me." So the labors of ambition are Sisyphean, right? They're arduous, they're grubby, potentially pointless, but they are the very labors for which Machiavelli longs, and it doesn't work. All right, so you can hint as much as you want about how much you love the life of books, but you'd be willing to enter a worldly service. But you're so enamored with the books, right? You're so lost in books and communing with the ancients because your real life isn't working. And if your real life was working, you wouldn't spend nearly as much time with the ancients, right? A normal person has to choose between interacting with a family member or a friend with whom they have good relations or spending time with the ancients is usually going to spend time with a flesh and blood member of their family or a friend. So the more successfully Machiavelli's letter creates and sustains his illusion of presence, of speech, the recovery of the past, and the glories of communing with the ancients, right, the more acutely does it impose the realization of the absence and loss in his own life. And so change is in the air in the 16th century. We get the printing press, books become more readily available, and so more people can lose themselves in books if real life proves to be too disappointing. And if reality is not to your liking, you can go stand on a different stage. You can go live in a different theater. You can inhabit a different world and just lose yourself in the pure ideas and the pure narratives of the great thinkers if people in real life are just too disappointing to you.
or we'll deal with Iran in due course. So you see, we thought that military force, coupled with the fact that the world was moving toward more and more liberal democracies, this is the Fukuyama argument, really allowed us to go on a rampage, which we have done since 9/11. And again, we were moving in that direction in the 1990s. And I think this is what allowed these two events, the end of the Cold War and the perceived victory, the I want to underline, false belief we had won in Afghanistan, allowed us to think that, we could act on that crusader mentality that was deeply embedded in the United States.
There was a major mistake, and one which history, which I suppose these people study very well, perhaps would have taught them would be a mistake. I mean, somebody once said, nobody loves armed missionaries.
I think it's interesting because often when people look at American foreign policy, they often dismiss the liberal rhetoric as simply camouflaging very crude power interest. But I do think that this is quite genuine, though. And Henry Kissinger made this argument in terms of when he wrote about world order as well. He was making the argument that this is liberalism is not just a cover for American dominance. It's also something very deeply embedded in the United States. This idea that they have to bring forth these ideals now also applying to the Europeans. But many would bring it further back, though, beyond the end of the Cold War, because I guess Woodrow Wilson would be the often recognized as the one who made the United States initially into a crusader state, because before then there had been the idea that, at least while it stood for liberalism would be spread by the US being this great example of how to organize a proper, peaceful society based on non-intervention. And I think it was in the First World War when Woodrow Wilson really came out and said, we have to make the world safe for democracies. This will be the war to end all wars. That this is really when the United States began, at least beyond the Americas, to convert itself from a role model to be emulated, to instead take on this active, offensive role as a crusader state, if you will. This is a good terminology, but I know it's very disputed because some people go back to 1898 with the defeat of the Spanish and the US getting their colonies, in which you have people like Mark Twain saying, this will poison the soul of America. I think it was William James. He wrote, "America puked up its soul." So a very dramatic language to suggest that the Americans weren't supposed to be like the Europeans, but they weren't supposed to become like us with this empire building. And this is when they essentially began to turn, when they made Manifest Destiny into a more of an international colonial project, if you will. But yeah.
Okay, let's leave it there for this week. I'll talk to you blokes